about the new MS4 permit, which will hopefully come out next year. And as a refresher or new information for those of you who don't know, there are 9 regional water quality control boards throughout the state, all of which are under the umbrella of the State Water Resources Control Board based out of Sacramento. They were established in 1949 to deal with water pollution problems that were emerging because of California's rapid development. And the regional boards and the state board implement both state and federal water quality laws. On the state side, primarily the California Water Code, and on the federal side, the Clean Water Act, which is why we have the municipal stormwater permits in the first place, because those are a requirement under the Clean Water Act. And so the purpose of the training today, primarily it's a permit requirement of the permittees. And when I talk about the permittees, those are all the cities and the county under this stormwater permit here in the Russian River watershed. And the post-construction stormwater requirements under the stormwater permit are complicated, and they change over time, and they use this LID manual to ensure that projects are complying with the stormwater post-construction requirements. And so every year we want to make sure that the regulated community is up to speed with what is in the LID manual. We want to make sure that the permit requirements and various interpretations of the permit requirements are discussed and understood, with the goal of ensuring we get consistent implementation of the stormwater permit. And also this training is a great opportunity to discuss the permit. So I want to go over some terms and acronyms that you'll be hearing today. BMP is a big one. That refers to, in the world of stormwater, any structural or non-structural strategy to control stormwater. And when we're talking about LID, we're talking about low impact development, which is a specific subset of best management practices. And in our region, in Region 1, in the North Coast region, and pursuant to the LID manual, when we're talking about low impact development, BMPs, we're talking about vegetated infiltration-based BMPs like rain gardens, bioretention basins, bioswales, grass filter strips, as opposed to non-vegetated BMPs like underground vaults that would capture untreated stormwater and infiltrate it into the ground. So when we're talking about LID, I'm sorry, I'm getting messages from Heaven Moore, who's having trouble getting in. So if somebody could reach out to Heaven and help her get into the meeting, that'd be great. Although, so if you have an underground vault, it can be part of a low impact development treatment train if you're first treating the water using a vegetated infiltration-based BMP before it goes underground for infiltration. And when we're talking about stormwater control, we're talking about 2 things. We're talking about controlling the stormwater quality, and that's stormwater treatment. And here's a list of 7 conventional pollutants that you find in stormwater that require treatment and that should be adequately treated using low impact development BMPs. And in addition to the quality, we're also talking about the quantity of stormwater that needs to be controlled to prevent hydromodification or downstream erosion. And the next presentation will go into more details on that.
Can I interrupt you just for a quick second, Brendan? I'm getting a message from someone that says that they can't get in. It says it's full at 100. So I don't know if we need to change that to 200 or something, Alyssa.
Yes, let me see if I can do that right now, Elizabeth. Thank you.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, well, I'll just continue.
Just keep going, Brendan.
All right, I'll just keep going. Okay, and also, since the stormwater programs have been around, we talk about post-construction best management practices. And as long as I can remember, since the early 2000s, that's the term that's been used to refer to the world of these kind of BMPs where you treat stormwater after the project's been completed on a permanent basis using features like this rain garden you see here in the picture. And as we prepare the next permit, we're considering changing the term from post-construction to something else. I know that in Region 2, the San Francisco Regional Water Board, their recent municipal regional permit, they're now using the term post-project BMPs. And I believe Caltrans refers to these kind of BMPs as permanent BMPs. And we're leaning towards changing it to permanent BMPs because it speaks pretty directly. It speaks more directly and easier to understand than post-construction and post-project perhaps. But we would really like to know what you guys think. And if you have a preference for one of these terms to refer to the universe of these types of BMPs, let us know, or maybe there's some other term that we don't have up here that you think would be better. So go ahead and put that in the chat if there's a term that you favor. That would help us out. So acronyms, more acronyms. MS4, Municipal Separate Storm Sewer System. And that's as opposed to the municipal sewer system, which carries wastewater to the treatment plant. The MS4, Municipal Separate Storm Sewer System, is the roads, the gutters, the storm drain system that carry water from the streets into creeks and other water bodies. This photo is from 1954. This is the Los Angeles storm drain system. This was back when they had, when the federal government did nuclear testing in the desert, and mutant ants flew into Los Angeles and took up residence in the storm drain system. And here's some municipal employees with their PPE having to get rid of this non-stormwater discharge. And of course, I'm joking, in case you didn't get that. SWLID is Stormwater Low Impact Development. And this used to be called the SUSIM, the Standard Urban Stormwater Mitigation Plan. And basically, for any given project, this is the game plan that addresses how any project will meet the MS4 stormwater LID requirements, as well as the LID manual requirements. So you might hear the term SWLID submittal. TMDL, Total Maximum Daily Load. This term comes from the Clean Water Act, and it refers to the maximum amount of any given pollutant that a water body can handle and still be a healthy water body and provide the beneficial uses to people and the environment. And the TMDL is, you hear it a lot because a lot of regulations are based on it. And the TMDL in itself is not a permit requirement. Instead, it's a plan to bring an impaired water body into an unimpaired condition. And it uses permits to do that. So when water board staff or planning staff develop a TMDL, they also develop an action plan. And part of the action plan is to recommend which specific permits should have requirements that will implement their action plan. And the MS4 stormwater permit is a major vehicle to implement TMDL requirements. So that's one of the reasons why we have these LID requirements. For instance, our board recently adopted a pathogen TMDL to deal with bacteria impairment in the Russian River watershed. And we anticipated this coming back in 2012 when the current permit was adopted and Santa Rosa and Sonoma County had to prepare pathogen work plans. And in the next permit, the rest of the permittees will have to do something as well to implement the action plan associated with the pathogen TMDL. Also, our planning staff is developing a Laguna de Santa Rosa TMDL to deal with the high nutrients, the high nitrogen and phosphorus, the high sediment, the high temperature, and the low dissolved oxygen that all feed off each other and create poor water quality conditions in the laguna. And so this TMDL, it's still a year or two out. So in this next MS4 permit, MS4 stormwater permit, we probably won't see any requirements related to this, but certainly in the following stormwater permit, we will. Also, trash permits. The State Water Board passed the trash amendment, which is a statewide policy. It's kind of like a TMDL in that it has an action plan to deal with trash, and it prescribes implementing that action plan through all the MS4 permits throughout the state. So all the municipalities are going to have to identify, and they already have identified, their high and medium and low trash generating areas, and they're going to have to provide either structural control measures like vortex separators to control trash from those areas, and or non-structural measures to deal with trash, such as plastic waste, plastic bag bans, or increased street sweeping, et cetera, those kind of things. And finally, as mentioned earlier, the Clean Water Act requires that municipalities be covered under MS4 stormwater permits, and the post-construction element is a required element in all of those permits, which is where low impact development is required. So we're currently under a MS4 permit that was adopted in 2016. And these permits they last 5 years. And so this one expired in 2021, but we didn't have a new permit ready to go. So the current permit has been administratively extended indefinitely. We're hoping to have a new MS4 permit before our board in December of next year at the soonest, which would mean that in July of next year, we would put a draft out for public comment for a 45-day public comment period. And that would also include a public workshop where we would present the proposed draft permit and accept public comment. And some changes that we're expecting in the next permit include an LID trigger drop from 10,000 square feet to 5,000 square feet. And so that is if you have a project that is redeveloping or adding 10,000 square feet of impervious surface or more, currently you have to implement LID. And we're proposing to drop that to 5,000 square feet because we are virtually the only region in the entire state that still has the 10,000 square foot threshold. Everybody else is at 5,000. I think Los Angeles Region 4 still has a 10,000 square foot requirement in there. But even in some regions, like in San Luis Obispo, I think the Salinas permit, they have a 2,500 square foot threshold. We also have criteria for LID offset projects. So we often hear from people who just can't fit LID into their projects and they want to know what they can do. And the current permit isn't very clear, or it doesn't provide a lot of clear options for alternatives to implementation. So we plan to write more specific criteria for both on-site and off-site offset of LID requirements. Also, stormwater to groundwater discharge criteria. I mentioned earlier that a LID BMP has to be vegetated, and it can't be considered LID if you just send untreated water straight to groundwater infiltration. But there may be instances where VADOS, where you get adequate treatment from the VADOS zone, and so we will lay out criteria for when you can go directly to groundwater discharge. So we will propose that in the next permit. Also, restrictions to backyard residential LID BMPs. We've found that a lot of projects, they can't fit LID BMPs anywhere, and they've put them in people's backyards in residential developments. And it's hard enough for the municipalities to inspect and keep track of the ones in the public right of way. It's nearly impossible for them to check up on backyard BMPs. Backyards are so small these days, and people get their houses. Oftentimes they don't even know what these BMPs are, and these BMPs get destroyed and they can't be checked on. So we want to see fewer of these. We would actually like to see them at all if possible. So also runoff, similarly, in the LID BMPs need to remain in place in perpetuity. The runoff reduction measures, there aren't any requirements that those be preserved. So we're going to see if we can address that in the next permit. And when I talk about runoff reduction measures, I'm talking about disconnected downspouts and trees, all of which are used in the LID calculator to lower the LID requirements. And finally, trash control requirements, discussed that earlier. The statewide trash amendment requires that the MS4 permit have trash control requirements. So that is all I have. If you have any questions, contact me anytime. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Brendan. So next up, we have Alyssa Overton and from the City of Sebastopol, and Elizabeth Cargay from the Town of Windsor, here for a presentation on vegetation and soils. So ladies, go ahead and take it away.
Sure thing. Can you see my slide okay?
Not yet.
No, not yet. Not sharing yet.
Well, that's no good.
This is Edie Takata, and I'm the one of the chat monitors, the main chat monitor. In the meantime, while we're waiting, can you we have a question from Jesse Glazier. Brendan, his comment / question is, I thought that 5K triggers regulated project and over 1 acre triggers hydro modification. Is that something you can answer quickly?
Yes. That is correct.
Okay. If that's the answer, great. If there's more, if there's elaboration, then maybe we could take it at the end, or if Jesse can contact you directly as you have asked if people have questions. Thanks a lot.
And are we okay now?
Yeah,
Yes.
we can make it now,
Yeah.
Alyssa.
Okay, great. Okay, so I'm Elissa Overton, and I assist the City of Sebastopol with their stormwater program, as well as the Town of Windsor with their LID program.
Oh, okay. I'm Elizabeth Cargay. I'm an environmental program manager. Well, there we go. I've been working with the town for about 6 years. And before that, I worked as a consultant for over 20 years on where I ran a soils lab, and I learned way too much about soils. Did a lot of field testing on soils and groundwater, and worked on all types of water and wastewater projects that how they relate to engineering. So today, Alyssa and I want to talk to you about bioswales and plants and soils. But before we do that, I wanted to do a little something different. I want to dedicate this talk. I'm going to dedicate this talk to my dad, who I lost earlier this year. He was an engineer, and although he worked in the aerospace engineering, in retrospect, at home, he harvested rainwater and did water conservation my entire life. He had 5 hernias from carrying the water that he collected from either in the house out to the garden, or from collecting all the water from the roof drains. And as an engineer, as a typical engineer, he had all these contraptions around the backyard to gather all the rainwater to feed the plants in his backyards. And he was always looking for ways to use his natural resources better. So we too could strive that way to design better LID features, to capture the runoff and to care for our creeks and our groundwater, and to do a better job and by learning from what we've done in the past and what works and what's not working with these features to do a better job. We need beautiful, worthy, and easy to maintain LID features. We need to be proud of these features so that the public And how they view these would be a good thing, that they actually want them. So our goal could be that people actually ask us for LID features to be put on their properties, right? All right, so first we're going to talk about the plants. Alyssa's going to be talking about that, and then I'll get into the vegetation and soil.
That was beautiful. Thank you, Elizabeth. So first, why are we so passionate about LID? In the image here on the right, there's a dramatic increase in the amount of hardscape that will not allow water to permeate or infiltrate into the soil and recharge the aquifer. In an environment like this, it equates to an estimated 55% of our stormwater gliding across these impervious surfaces like roads, parking lots, and rooftops. And it warms up that water and it gathers sediment, oils, tire wear particles, construction runoff, heavy metals, viruses, bacteria, nutrients from pet waste, so on, so on. So many constituents to list. And these constituents, they go directly into our streams, our rivers, our lakes, and so on. And they're all harmful to wildlife, and they kill native vegetation. They foul the drinking water and disrupt aquatic life and the reproduction cycle. The water, well, it's going to pick up tremendous erosional speed on these surfaces. So by the time it reaches these sensitive waterways, the excess volume can blast out stream banks, vegetation, wipe out aquatic habitat. The stream bank, well, it can't absorb water fast enough at that magnitude, so it's going to cause flooding. In the image on the left, you'll notice that in a natural environment, the runoff, it's significantly decreased. Water, it likely has a chance to move through the vegetation, to slow down, filtrate pollutants, as well as channel the water deep into the aquifer. Notice there is a 20% difference in deep infiltration here. And evapotranspiration, well, that's going to increase as well. This came up weird, so I have to click on the different screens to get this to progress. So sorry, guys. So incorporating LID is just one of the ways we can reduce the impacts of development. By maximizing the surface roughness and creating infiltration and filtration opportunities, it will increase that evapotranspiration and keep water on site. It can alleviate some of the urban impacts to our water. Another great benefit is trees, soil, and the aquifer. They all will sequester the water, and that will boost our waterways during the driest months of the year when we see no rain, which is very typical in this region, as we all well know. And not all LID features include vegetation. Those that do not, such as an infiltration trench, those are part of a treatment train where the water is going to be introduced to vegetation at a different part of the path. And plant selection and design, these are very important pieces that are determining factors in the success of these features. But sadly, they're often left until the end, and the design, well, it's contracted to someone who wants to make it look pretty, and they don't understand the true importance of the function of the design or the correct vegetation selection or the correct place to place the vegetation. Find that these features are sometimes plugged into the design at the last minute, and there's potentially safety hazards. So, for example, in this image, up here on the left, you'll notice if you parked alongside this feature, it's going to be really difficult to get in and out of your car. So while beautiful and functional, there's functional to clean water, it's not functional for pedestrians. Great solutions are shown in this middle photo with pavers, or down here with these cute little path bridges up to their front steps. Up in the right-hand corner, this parking lot, great, you can get in and out of your vehicle, but there hasn't been a lot of thought to the pedestrian foot traffic. You need to get to point A to point B. You're going to need to cross over this feature, and stirrup sediment, compact soil, hill vegetation. Not a lot of people want to walk all the way around. They'll take the path of least resistance to get to point A to point B. Another thing to think of is tree placement or high bush placement. If they're put out on a corner, they can obstruct oncoming views such as traffic, and that's another safety hazard. So the types and plants and features you choose, they may be different depending on if you're in a low density, high density, in the middle of a city, along a body of water, or in a transportation setting alongside the road. The residential image, again, it shows the parking on the street issue. And then there's also a missed opportunity here to plant the lowest level of this swale. We really want to get those grasses in there, the sedges and the rushes to slow the water infiltrate and permeate water into that soil. Rocks, while sometimes beautiful, they can really dry and heat up the soil, and it will make it difficult to maintain. So weeds, they love that rocky environment, and it will make it difficult to pull them if the water or the soil is pushed down with the weight of the rocks. And if you put fabric underneath those rocks, it's ultimately going to just clog. The high density residential, I really like the rocks that they've placed to stabilize the slope and help divert the water as it flows into the feature. So this is looking pretty good. They can add a little color, and they've corrected the parking issue, the street parking issue here. The urban setting, now while I wish they had planted further in towards this, woo, I'm getting happy with the clicker here, towards the overflow drain here. It's constructed, this is the thing I want to note on this. It's at the correct height. So the function of this feature is water is to come into it and fill up to allow it time to permeate, not over 72 hours, because we don't want to add other issues such as mosquitoes or flooding. But we don't want these drains like you would construct your bathtub or sink. We need them raised up to allow that water time to infiltrate. Transportation. This is great for source pollution control. There's little inlets to let water into that vegetative strip in the center of the busy 4-lane road. But think about maintenance. I would not want to be out there pruning or weeding this area. And also it could potentially obstruct views if there's an area, it's like further up that you can turn in or out. So just really be mindful in your design on placement of these things. Okay, so now this slide. So this is the LID manual, and Edie, I can't access the chat, so if you wouldn't mind pasting the link in the chat to get to this manual on the City of Santa Rosa website. I know many of you are already using this manual, but we have people of different experience levels on the call. So I just wanted to quickly direct folks to this manual and what a great tool it is. It will guide you through sites that will trigger LID, help you with feature selection in natural areas, pollutants of concern, trash capture. It will guide you through the submittal process and what to include, your design requirements, provide useful calculations and formulas such as hydro modification control requirements, 100% treatment requirements, and delta volume capture. Maintenance and inspection requirements are included, as well as the BMP fact sheets that outline feature details and inspection checklists for each type. And of course, our plant list is included as Appendix F and soils, which Elizabeth will be going over in just a moment. So here we have a little cutout of Appendix F. You'll see where the plants are separated by growth structure. So your grasses, herbaceous, shrubs, and your trees. Now, this is just a little clip of it. These lists are very long. And there's pages of ideas for you, for your plants, planting your features. And then they're further divided by the plant hydrology zone, whether you're going to be planting in the low zone, the mid zone, or the high zone, the feature type. So you'll see the different types of features listed up here, and the plants are listed on the left here. And then the water requirements that those plants have. So it's really useful. So what's the big deal about plants? And we're really asking a lot of them. Well, basically, they're the janitors, the cleanup crew. They're going to provide filtration of sediment, the constituents, bark, keep the bark from going down the drain, and the trash. They clean, I should say mulch and not bark, but they clean the air through carbon sequestration. There's plumbing. So through infiltration, they're going to drive water back into the soil to replenish groundwater supplies, recharge the aquifer to redistribute the vegetation in the dry months, and help maintain the base flow to our streams, rivers, and wetlands. So really important stuff. They provide housing for different types of species, create different ecosystems. Habitat is really beneficial part of these features. The food, they're going to attract food for different types of birds and other species, and they can support pollinators. They are the HVAC, so they create microclimates to allow species to keep warm in the winter or cold in the summer, counteract the harsh environment or the harsh rising temperatures of hardscape. Structural engineers, they're going to stabilize that soil and prevent erosion and stop additional sediment from entering our storm drains, thus suffocating and preventing fish eggs from hatching in our streams and rivers. They perform crowd control. So they're going to slow that water, allow it time to infiltrate and filtrate, and also prevent erosion. And of course, they have to do sales, marketing. They need to look beautiful without a lot of intervention and maintenance, so others will want to mimic these features in their landscape and boost property values, which is important. So like a good employer, how can we give these guys the best possible, outcome? Okay, sorry about that, guys. Okay, so we have our different zones of planting. The littoral section, or the fully submergent section, that's not an area that we're going to generally plant, and it's not an area that's found in our features. This is an area that holds water almost 100% of the time. And again, like I mentioned, we need them to drain within 72 hours so that it doesn't attract mosquitoes and cause other issues in a high water event. The emergent riparian section, that's where we're really going to focus on that low level planting. It's the lowest point at the LID feature and should be planted in a way that can slow and filtrate water. That's the main function, and stabilize that soil. They need to be able to withstand full saturation as well as drought conditions in the dry months. Grasses and sedges, those are the workhorses in this section. Grasses and sedges, they have the deep fibrous root systems that not only hold onto the soil, but they form numerous root channels. So they really stabilize and promote water soaking deep into that soil. In the soil part, Elizabeth will dive into some more later on. The riparian and floodplain areas. I have floodplain down here. It's kind of a mixture between the riparian and the upland. You're going to want to use this area as your beautifying area. So, you know, salvias, sages, spice bushes, wax myrtles, blanket flowers, all these beautiful types of plants can be planted in this area because they can withstand being, you know, more water, but then also be able to handle a drought. Because sadly, that's what we are undergoing right now. And then in your floodplain, upland areas, that's your opportunity to put your trees that can't stand full saturation because it would cause root rot and the bark to rot. If you need trees in the lower section, that's where you want to have trees that can handle water, such as a willow. And then up high, you want your drier plants to use as beautification and shade and habitat, and really promote the aesthetic value of these features. So when you're thinking about planting, you need to be mindful of all the things I've already mentioned. You know, this is beautiful to some, but might not be pretty to everyone. Some people like a more countryside look, like up here. But the issue up here is they haven't added the grasses to this lower level. So that's really important. And in here, in this area, they've really done a nice job for safety. No one can hide in these bushes really well. They've used different colors of grasses so that it's pleasing to the eye. You can use, if you want to plant the upper areas of this, you know, you can use those, the Nuka rose or other plants that just really beautify, like a high bush cranberry and the salvias and sages. Am I missing anything, Elizabeth? You can chime in if I'm forgetting something.
No, you're doing great. Yeah, the idea is to be creative, right? We want to be creative with our plants to make it look nice and function well.
So this is my final slide. You won't have to listen to me anymore. So there seems to be a misunderstanding that we can create these features and just forget about them. So before planting, there needs to be serious consideration about who will be maintaining your site and how often that maintenance should occur. The plants and the placement and the function of these features, they need to be clearly identified on your plan. So folks dealing with maintaining these features later on can truly understand their function. We can't see what's going on under the surface. We don't know the soils that have been planted or the plants that were intended to stay alive and their placement. We can guess, but those things need to be clearly identified on the plan. Weeds, they need to be pulled. You can't just plant it and forget it. It's not going to take care of itself, especially in the beginning. The plant structure, broken branches, obstructing the line of sight, or just for overall plant health, they need to be taken care of. Dead plants, replant them, preferably in the fall, so they can get the benefit of the water during the wet months of the year. Tree debris, so if you have trees, deciduous trees and evergreen trees both shed needles and leaves, so that needs to be picked up. And my natural resources geek side, that sometimes is hard for me because I want to allow those things to fall and replenish the soil, feed the soil, and I think of the microbes and all that stuff. But these types of features, they're not for that. That's not, there's other opportunities to create that in our communities. These are assets, they have a function, they need to remain clean and free of that debris. Soil stabilization. So make sure that those plants are alongside the soil. The slopes of the feature so that it really holds on to it and isn't adding to the sediment issue. Irrigation. So this is a big one. I come out to these sites and it's just a mess. The emitters are not within the root zone. Those emitters, the root ball of a plant in the first couple of years of life is immediately under that plant. And those emitters need to be directly on top of the soil, providing that plant with water. Off to the side will work as those roots really start to form and in later years, because we need to keep that irrigation on for drought years, but it needs to be regularly irrigated in the first couple of years. So that's another misconception. Just because they're low water use, that's after establishment. So splash diverters, those are another thing that are very important. We see those just kicked to the side or all over the place, and those are really going to stop that high water flow from preventing erosion. And then like overflow drains. So I mentioned before that nice overflow drain that was really high up. Look at this one right here on the right. It looks like a sink drain. So what's going to happen is water, if it can make it in there through the rocks, it's just going to go directly down in that drain, and it's not going to receive the benefits of the weeds. While weeds are still going to provide benefit, they're not going to provide aesthetic value. And then pruning, again, like making sure that this inlet is clear so that the water has a chance to come here through here and go through the sedges and the rushes before it enters the drain, and ultimately it would pool around here, and this would only be an overflow situation. And then you'd want planting. These need to stay over 50% planted to be functional. So this is just going to cause sediment to rush down here. In this scenario, over in this area, there is a trash receptacle hut for this community building. So the water is just diverted directly into the trash receptacle. And then there's further LID features on the other side. So it goes through the trash area and then into another LID feature. So so it should be entering here and diverting the trash area, ideally. So I think I've about covered what I'm going to cover. Elizabeth's going to go over soils, and again, Elizabeth, make sure you add in anything I might have missed in my spiel here.
Okay, thanks. Okay, let's move to the next one there. Thank you. Okay, so let's talk soil, media, and mulch. Whoops, go back. Not yet. There you go. Okay, so what's the problem here? So terminology, consistency. We need consistency in our LID terms, from the Swidlid report through design, construction, and landscaping installation. So the team of those involved from design to maintenance can really understand the intent of the feature. So let's take a deeper look at the terms. Next slide. Oops.
My mouse is really happy here.
Back one. There we
Go ahead.
So how many of you have read a stormwater LID report or reviewed one that says they want to install a rain garden? Oh, but then the plans call it a bioretention BMP. And then the maintenance plan calls it a vegetated swale. The contractor calls it a grassy swale. And the landscaper, who's just getting familiar with these features, calls them all just bioswales. We have to separate these terms and use them consistently. Next slide. So I created this table to better understand the differences between these. So on the left, there's the y-axis that just shows all the feature names, and it describes them a little bit, you know, vegetated swales, bioswales, grassy swales, vegetated buffers, infiltration basins, on and on. On the x-axis, it shows the various variations in function. This is really important to understand the differences, and so we can use these terms more consistently throughout all of our jurisdictions. And it can be used to train the contractors and landscapers better. So some of the differences are really quite simple. Like the first couple of ones is it above ground or below ground? Well, a flow through planter is above ground. A swale is not, period. There you're done. The shape, if it's a circular shape, more like a rain garden, or a linear like a swale. If it's linear, call it a swale. Don't call it a rain garden. If it's on a single slope, it's not a swale. A swale has a parabolic or a trapezoidal shape. These single sloped features are more like vegetative buffers. If there's an underdrain infrastructure, then it's bioretention. It's not a bioswale. And if there are plants or not, if it's a bioswale and it's not an infiltration trench. So let's look at a few examples. So move on to the next one. There we go. So grassy swale and a bioswale. I have people say grassy bioswale. It's like, let's try to keep the terms separate. What's a grassy swale? It's literally a swale that's planted with just grass, like the photo shows. So, but a bioswale tends to be more longitudinal, has various heights, grasses, shrubs, perennials, and all the different planting zones like Alyssa was talking. Let's use the terms that best describe what you're putting them in. Let's call them swales if they're longitudinals, not rain gardens. Next one. Infiltration trenches. An infiltration trench is not a bioswale just because it looks like kind of like a swale. It doesn't have plants and it doesn't provide treatment. So don't call this a bioswale. Call it the infiltration trench. Next. So bioretention unit. Okay, is this a swale? No, it doesn't have the slope of a swale. It's not longitudinal. So call it a basin, a unit, a cell, but don't call it a swale. Keep it clear. Now, is it a bioinfiltration or unit or a bioretention unit? And so what's the difference? So bioretention is used if there's piping involved for high flow bypass, like this picture shows. Bioinfiltration is a key term to use if there's runoff and infiltration happening, but it doesn't usually have the overflow pipes. If there's overflow piping, use bioretention term, don't use infiltration. These terms are important to distinguish between our LID features. And it's also a good idea to go over these features at, say, your pre-con meetings with your contractors so they can fully understand the purpose of each of these filters and the delicacy of these features. Okay, next one. So let's talk a little bit about what's underneath these features. So we have these typical layers where we have the mulch layer, and then below that tends to be the bioretention or structural soils to filter. And then sometimes you'll see optional undergrain gravels and sands. A lot of times around here, we don't even have those. They're just, the piping is in the bioretention soils. And then the native soils. So we have to fully understand the differences between these soils and when we need to use bioretention soils and when we don't. If the native soils happen to be a nice sand that may have, 10 infiltration rate of 10 inches per hour, then do you need to put in different kinds of soils? No, you can use the native soils and just make it a bioswale. Of course, that doesn't happen very often in Sonoma County or around here. Our native soils are just sort of the opposite. We don't have a lot of infiltration, but they're not being checked before construction. Next. So let's talk a little bit about soils. Oops, I think you missed one. Oh, okay, let's talk about soils. Go to the next one. Okay, there we go. So what is a soil? Let's talk a little bit about that. So soil is a mixture of sizes of grains of sand, gravels, sands, silts, and clays, but it has with it organic matter, minerals, liquids, and organisms that together support life. So how do we characterize the soil? So for our purposes, we'll characterize the soil by the size of the particles. The LID manual separates the soils into hydrologic groups of A, B, C, and D. But let's see how this relates to the particle size. So you can see in this picture, very coarse, the gravel's on the side, and there's some sizes there that help you understand it. But the photos really kind of show you when you're in the field what these look like. So when you get down to the silts, you can see it's a lot finer than the sand, and you really can't see the particles. And when you get into clays compared to silts, they tend to be a lot stickier. They stick together very well. Next. So the soils and the A, B, C's, and D's are based on the USDA soils classification. The LID manual says to go to the Natural Resource Conservation Service or the USDA to identify what types of soils you have. What does this mean? So here's how it works. It's typically shown, soils are typically shown in this triangle where it gives the specific mixtures of soil particles by the percentages of sand, silt, and clay. You can see it goes from 0 to 100 on each side of the triangle for clay, sands, and silts. So to classify a soil, you determine the percentage of all 3 particle sizes and graph it to determine what soils you have. So there's green lines on there. So say you had a sample that had 23% clay, you can see that green line there, 42% silt and 35% sand. And then where those lines line up together, that tells you what kind of sand you have. That's a loam. So the loam is kind of in the middle. It's similar amounts of all 3 particle sizes. But the names of the soil will determine which hydrologic group it's in, A, B, C, or D. So let's go to the next one. So A soils are the sands, the loamy sands, the sandy loams. They, of course, have low runoff and high infiltration. And then it goes on down the line. The B soils are more silty and loamy. C soils have a little more clay in them. And D is where you're going to have all of your clays and they have very low infiltration rates. So when we want to put these 2 things together, the hydrologic soils and the USDA soil charts, I'm going to go to the next one. This is kind of a visual where I tried to overlap them. So you can see the type A soils are going to be in blue on the lower left-hand corner for the sands, the loamy sands, and the sandy loams. And then it goes on down to the different B's, C's, and D's. And the D's are going to be more like all your clays. And a lot of, once you have over about 35% clay, you're going to be in the hydrologic zone of zone D. So the engineer looks up the USDA soils for their particular site, and then they determine the soils that likely exist for their project to use in their design LID features. However, it's important to understand that the USDA soils maps are intended for agricultural use and growing crops. They are being used in the LID manual for infiltration, and that's important, but they're not exactly created one for the other. So the map gives you the idea of soils as an approximation for the near surface soils, but it's not site specific, and the data is actually pretty old that they've used. I've seen more than once where the contractor digs up the area where the LID feature is supposed to go, and the soils look different than what the reports are saying. It's not their fault. It's not like they looked it up wrong. It's just an approximation. It doesn't always totally match. Okay, go to the next one. So where can you get the information you really need to make sure? Well, it would be to do site specific. So I go to the geotech report. However, when a geotech engineer goes out to your site, he classifies the soils for strength for foundations and uses the unified soil classification system. They still classify it by grain size, but they use other things like plasticity, organics, and gravels in the nomenclature. Instead of calling it a loam like we had earlier in our example of 23% clay, 42% silt, and 35% sand, they would call it an ML or a sandy clay silt, depending upon the plasticity of the soils. In other words, you can't go directly to get the information in the geotech report unless you ask them to give you the percentages of sand, silt, and clay to match your USDA soils type in the triangle to determine your hydrologic groups that you need to know for infiltration. So I suggest working with your geotech to identify the percentages so you can better design your LID features with the soils that are actually present at your site. They could simply do one extra boring and do a shallow boring on your site where an LID feature is going to go. And then you know exactly what kind of soils you have, and you will not be surprised during construction, hopefully, to see that your soils will match your design. All right, next slide. All right, let's talk about these soils, structural soils. This is going to be the types of soils that are installed above the native soils where the native soils can't be used. So structural soils, what are they? So they're subangular, usually the gravels here with some fines and organics that allow for the ideal infiltration. That's the key. But as the name implies, the soil is used for load-bearing capacity next to roads and buildings. If not near these, then soils could be used. But this is engineered soil. It's special soil. It's well graded, usually medium and coarse sand. It's subangular. That helps lock the soils together and preserve the voids. And it's usually washed to remove the fines and maintain the porosity. And then they blend it with organics. They have high quality mineral soils mixed into the plantings. This is not class 2 perm soils. It has some organics in it to allow for the planting. And then a lot of times it'll have this hydrogel that's added as a tackifier, and it prevents segregation of the soils and the rocks. Then it's moisture controlled to be able to compact it correctly. This soil is special, and it should not be placed and allowed to have construction equipment run over it or have construction sediment flow into it. It needs to be protected. I've seen sites where they've put in their LID feature early in construction, and I've seen house paint, nails, construction debris, and even stucco sitting on top of this soil and their LID features. So please keep these protected once you put the soils in. Next, let's talk about the difference here between the structural soil and bioswale soils. You can see biosoils in that pile is a lot finer. So what's the main difference? Well, it's finer. That's really the main difference. It has sand as its highest content, doesn't contain gravel. And if you don't have load bearing, back one, there we go. If you don't have load bearing issues, then use this bioswale mix. So what makes it special? Same thing as a structural soil. It's well graded, coarse and medium fine and medium sand. It's subangular to protect and lock in the voids. It's washed like the structural soil, but it's mixed with a certain amount of organics to allow it to grow plants in it. So I found this thing where online business called Gale Materials, where they had the designated percolation rates for the various types of bioswale soils. So they have a sandy based soil for bioswale soils as 10 inches plus per hour infiltration rate. And then the loamy sand, more of a medium, is like that 5 to 10 inches per hour. And then a sandy loam blend, which has a slower percolation of less than 5 inches per hour. But we want to keep above that 5 inches per hour as our main goal in any of our LID features. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about topsoil. Do you need it? So, oops, back one.
I swear I breathe too hard and it goes. Okay, there we go.
Okay, so I hear so many landscapers out in the field say, we have to put topsoil on top of it, or the plants won't grow in those structural soils or in the bioswale soils. Go on to the next one. But if we use the bioswale soils properly, then do we really need topsoil? No, we don't. Topsoil is not engineered for infiltration. It can have too much organics in it. It may not drain properly. It could have too much clay. We want to keep it to less than 5%. It's best to use the native or the bioswale as structural soil in these bioswale soils. However, they do need some protection against weeds and to hold moisture. Next. So here's a great example of what I'm talking about. Why do we need mulch? We've got some of these features have so many weeds in them that it's almost impossible to try to keep them looking nice. So from the beginning, we should be using mulch. So these are the weeds that were growing in the bioswale. You can hardly even see that there is a drain in there, and they look terrible. But we don't want to use pesticides in them, so let's use mulch. But what kind of mulch? What makes sense to use in these LID features? Next.
Another thing about this photo is this water is going to go directly into this drain without the treatment. So possibly thinking putting the drain at a different
location.
spot.
Right, definitely. That needs to be part of the next set of standards. But if it's dug down enough, that like that one was supposed to be, it's supposed to be down enough that so many weeds have filled in around it that you can't even, it doesn't even look like it's raised up, but it was.
Yeah.
But anyway, so here's the differences here between mulch and bark. So we really want to use mulch. Mulch tends to be shredded. And composted arbor mulch is the best, and it tends to cling the pieces together. Bark does not. So arbor mulch is best to use for weed control. It's better to trap the particulates of contaminants that we may have, and it works best to retain the moisture. So the composted mulch is even better for fire considerations because it's not very flammable. Next. So there's different kinds of protection that could be used. This is like coir fiber. So it's a natural byproduct of the coconut. It meets many of the requirements of mulch. You know, it prevents compaction. It helps sandy soils retain nutrients and moisture and stops sedimentation. But it's highly flammable. So we really don't want to be using the coir fabric. Next. So what about jute? I see people trying to use jute as this, but jute, it does not keep the weeds out. It's really just used for as a temporary construction BMP. It doesn't retain moisture. It's more of for erosion control and best used on slopes. So let's use arbor mulch and not bark and not the jute.
Hey, Elizabeth.
Yeah.
Can I interrupt you for a second? There's a really good question that's in the chat right now from Sam. And he wants to know what to do if a landscaper won't warranty the plant list if the bioretention media is or structural soil is without planting layer.
I would say let's go talk to him and educate him about what the soils are. That's part of the problem is landscapers don't understand what this soil is and how it's actually designed. It's engineered soil. It's meant specifically, and it has a certain amount of organics in it. The hydrogel that's put in there actually helps keep the material well mixed. And that's the reason why this soil is so special and needs to be taken care of in special ways where it's kept covered, it's moisture controlled, all of that. So it goes in well and can be used well. But I think that's the most important thing is we need to educate them. Next. All right, let's talk a little bit about construction sequencing with these bioswales and bioretention units. Let's not install these bioswales early. They get run over, they get filled with sediment from construction, and they rarely get protected well enough that they don't have to be reconstructed. So let's wait as long as you can in your construction process before putting these in. But if you do put them in early, you need to protect them. Like this project showed that they tried to put in the filter fabric over it, but they didn't dig it in. So the filter fabric, you can see it's right next to this slope. This slope has been sprayed, but on the side of the slope over time, it's just the sediment's just going to go right down to the bottom of that slope and right into that bioswale. And unless it's dug in so that it stays separate and keeps your soil clean, you're going to have to dig these up and redo it again. We don't want to have to do that. Next. So just one last thing about testing and when you should test. So, and how we should test. So if they're installed at the end of the construction project where we know they've been kept clean and they haven't been used for sediment control or anything like that, we don't want them to do that. But if they did, then if they're clean, I don't think we need to honestly test them for infiltration. But if they're installed early and not kept up well, or there's been sediment getting into them over the rainy season, then they should be tested. And this shows what a double ring infiltrometer looks like. This is the type of test we'd want to be doing. And I think we should test them before you plant and mulch. And that way it doesn't kill off your plants or because sometimes you could have a lot of water coming into these things to test them. So you can use this double ring infiltrometer. And the reason they use this is because it actually controls the lateral flow as well as the vertical flow. And so when you test it, you're testing this vertical flow and it's contained within the second ring of the infiltrometer. So it doesn't, so you're not just testing it moving laterally. You can also do it by hand if you don't have a double ring infiltrometer. You can, but you have to, we've had to fill up the whole bioswale with water sort of to pre-wet it and then test it to make sure it can infiltrate, at least 5 inches per hour. Okay, so in summary, the next one.
Okay, now I'm just completely dead. My
Uh-oh.
computer just froze. So,
Oh, okay.
uh,
Well, basically, you know, we're just trying to use consistent terms throughout all the documents. We want to be creative. We want to plant plants in the right zones and in ways that are aesthetically pleasing to be easily maintained. And so the public actually likes what they see, that we enjoy them, but yet they really fulfill their purpose. So let's do a better job of designing these LID features so we can be proud to give them to the public. That's it.
yeah. Sorry about that last slide. Yeah, my
That's okay.
computer all went blank and all I could see was you guys all of a sudden. So, you know, technology is really nifty sometimes. Another thing to mention is that I forgot to mention is when you're maintaining these features, you want to take out that old bark or mulch before you replenish it, because ultimately it's just going to keep raising that level at the soil level, which we don't want to occur. So,
Right. And we
that's
don't, yeah, we don't want those organics to get mixed into our soils too much. So Alyssa and I were kind of talking, thinking, you know, at least once every couple years, just pull out the mulch and put some new fresh mulch in.
And again, that's very different from a natural resources setting,
Right.
Or type environment. But again, we're trying to assist our urban environment and not create a natural environment, but use natural elements in our features to help us out. So that's it.
So we're going to share our presentation, I think, on the Streets to Creeks website. Is that right, Nick? We'll be sharing it all there for our website. Okay. So that, like the table, somebody asked about the table I created. That'll be up there.
Hey, Elizabeth and Alyssa, if you've got and Alyssa Keenan, if you can check on time. We have a couple of questions in the chat. Do we have time to address them?
We're about 10 minutes behind schedule. So
I'd say let's address them, Melissa.
yeah,
It'll be okay.
yeah, it's on
Yeah.
topic.
Okay, super. Okay, the first in this set, Dustin Maxim asks, how often should BMP structural soil and plants be replaced, i.e. accumulation of pollutants, you know, because accumulation pollutants, microplastics by accumulation of toxins. So how often should BMP structural soil and plants be replaced?
Well, I think that's going to have to do with the sedimentation. If I have a little core that I take out in the field, and then I core the middle of the LID feature. And if I see a lot of sediment gathering on top, that's when I would replace at least the top few inches. And then if it looks clogged all the way through, then you're going to have to collect more of that. But I would really use those as your guide. I don't think there is something that says you have to replace it every 2 years or every 5 years. Like maybe the Filterra trees, they're supposed to be replaced. But I think you really have to use the guide of how much sediment and how much clogging has happened. So you have to look at it and check it.
And just watching your plants and evaluating their health. The maintenance crew should really understand the correct maintenance for each of those plants and how they want to be pruned, if they're looking sick and need to be replaced, and so on and so forth. So it's an understanding of your maintenance crew as well. Right.
And you know that you raised that issue of maintenance. Some of these plants, they do not need that much care. We have people, some landscapers are mow and blow type guys where they want to just trim it down to nothing, good for the winter. But you know what? That kills a lot of these plants. We're finding we have to replace plants because they've been over pruned. But really read up on each types of these plants to know that some of them, just leave them be. They don't need to be trimmed except maybe a little bit for height. The grassy swales, I see people trying to mow them. It's like, no, those are meant to grown to 4 to 8 inches long. Then maybe you need to mow them a bit, but leave them. They don't need that much pruning.
And the hacking is occurring in the fall months of the year. So ultimately that vegetation is no longer there during the high water excuse me, events. So take out the dead pieces so they don't cause clogging, but you need to leave that plant structure intact.
Okay, thanks. And then we have one more question on this subject of BMP maintenance again, from Peter. Organic materials eventually decompose, leaving only the mineral components subject to compaction due to action of infiltrating water and soil chemistry. I find in my veg garden, I need to work in organic matter to replenish organics. How is this issue to be addressed in BMP maintenance?
Yeah, I do the same thing in my vegetable garden, and no till, allow those roots to decompose, and the more organic matter, the compost, it's all great for my veggie garden. But in these features, we just need to make sure that they're draining properly, and if they're not, ultimately that media needs to be replaced. And as Elizabeth mentioned, it has the components those plants need to survive. So if they're not surviving, look at your irrigation, look at the media, is it clogged, and those types of things.
Right, and that's why we're talking about replacing the mulch once in a while, so we don't get a lot of that compaction and clogging. It's going to happen over time, but replacing it every couple of years probably is just a good idea.
Okay, thanks a lot. I think that's it for questions, and the rest of the comments in the chat are addressed in different ways. Thanks.
All right, thanks.
Great. Thank you so much, Elisa and Elizabeth. That was wonderful and really good dialogue as well. We are now going to move into our first segment of our engineering panel discussion. So let me go ahead and share my screen, actually. All right. So our panel today is comprised of municipal engineers who are.
You cut out,
Oh.
Alyssa.
Uh-oh. Can you hear me?
We can hear you now.
Oh my goodness. Sorry about that, Body. Our panelists are Dennis McCarty, Jesus McCaig, and Rogelio Rodriguez from the city of Santa Rosa, along with Kat Harvey from the town. Feel free to raise your hands or submit questions in the chat, and they'll do their best to answer them. If we can't get to them, we will save them for the Q&A session at the end of the training. So Colleen, why don't you go ahead and take us away?
Great, thanks, Alyssa. I am subject to an unstable internet connection. So first I want to make sure that you can hear me.
Yep, yes, I can.
Okay. And so I'm going to keep my video off just to hopefully keep this going. So welcome everyone to our panel discussion. I'd like to start off by thanking our panelists. We're going to run through a series of questions with the objective of really trying to improve various elements of plan design and to make review life easier. So giving everybody the objective of having a more streamlined project to be reviewed. And so we want to tackle some issues today to try to better communicate what's needed to have a good plan set submitted so our plan reviewers can easily give you the stamp of approval. So we'll go ahead into the first question. Alyssa, if you want to advance the slide. And so, Jesus, welcome to our panel. The first question is for you. And what are some common issues that municipal reviewers come across during LID submittal and review process?
Hello, everybody. Jesus at City of Santa Rosa here. And basically, I look at a lot of these projects as they come through for the entitlement review. So I'm the first person who does look at the initial SULIDS report. And some things that I have found that are not in every single report, but issues that are prevalent are LID details. Sometimes the applicants will use their own detail as opposed to that in the manual. And frequently I have found that the notes don't match, or there will be changes that conflict in some way with the detail in the manual. And that not only creates extra review time, it also makes it in some cases where we can't approve it because it won't meet the intent of the manual. Another one is irrigation plans and planting plans. Sometimes the irrigation plan, which might not be part of the report, it's part of other separate documents for the same project. will not match the plant to plant. That is a problem. And occasionally also the information has to contour and elevation, so you can verify that the flows are meeting or actually reaching the BMPs on site. They're not always on the same page. They could be strewn about, or sometimes they're not there at all. And making sure that the water gets to the BMP in the first place is one of the biggest things. I can kind of go down the list here.
Yeah, I think Alyssa's having a lot of issues with her.
Oh no, have people been
connection
able to
right
hear
now.
me?
So
I can
it's
see
gonna be a repeat
myself
list.
and I can
Yeah.
hear myself.
We can definitely hear you.
Yeah,
Okay,
sorry about that, guys.
if you can't see me, I can verify my camera is on. Nick is probably checking to make sure that it is on.
Yes, we
Inside
can.
joke.
We can see you too.
Okay. Another one that comes up is, and this is pretty common because everybody's using over and over as a template. And sometimes there's previous project information that's still inside that report. And you just have to proofread that narrative. It'd be nice if the designer proofread it better, but often we'll find that wrong streets are called out, or different volumes of water are used, or the wrong creeks noted in there. That's annoying, but it's something that we find. Or it doesn't, the narrative may in some cases skip over things that we need it to cover, like the trash capture, or if there's contamination on site, especially if they're using that to support using a different priority of BMP, like priority 3. If it's not contamination on site, then the support for using that might not be there. Also, if there's high groundwater, that's not always addressed. And these are things we need to know as the reviewer. And another one that frequently happens is that in cases where the existing conditions exhibit is required, and as I read the manual, it's required anytime there's any structures on site or any impervious on site. And sometimes it's just not there, even when there is some impervious area or some existing structures. It's not just an open field. And sometimes this one, it's not always, and it's getting better, but when the composite CN is used, the worksheet should be included so we can verify the assumptions made and verify the areas that go into the composite number. And if that's not there, I mean, we can eyeball the plan, but it's a whole lot easier if they give us that backup, or if they just use the table, which the table has more readily available information. But if you want to really fine tune it, you can use the composite number, but you need to give us the backup, or where did you get it? We don't know. And that's my list. I don't know if anybody else wants to jump in and add other common issues that they're encountering with the submittals that come in at that stage, or during plan check as well. I would imagine is similar issues when reviewing the final as opposed to the initial SULIDs.
Well, thanks so much. Do we have any other comments from the other panelists on common issues for the submittal and review process? All right. Well, thanks so much, Jesus. We'll move on to our second question. This is for Steve. And Steve, could you discuss what's needed from design engineers and contractors to expedite, streamline, and/or improve the review process?
Sure. Thank you, Colleen. And for those who don't know me, my name is Steve Snow. I'm a civil engineer and the floodplain manager for Sonoma County. So when we're talking about expediting LID projects, when you're preparing your LID submittal for municipal review, your best bet is to start with the LID submittal guide. This is a checklist that municipal staff use when reviewing LID submittals, and making sure to address every point on the checklist will help to ensure completeness of your report and expedite the process. This form can be found on the City of Santa Rosa's website in the LID tools section. Alyssa, do you think you can please pull that up and show everybody the form I'm talking about?
Yeah, definitely. Just a quick question for the group. Can you guys see the PowerPoint or do you see the background of the PowerPoint?
We see the PowerPoint with the question.
Okay, great. Perfect. Here is the website. Can you guys see this?
We can.
Yes.
Okay. And here is the list.
Awesome. Thanks, Alyssa. So page 1 and 2 there are your standard project information entries, and then pages 3 and 4, those are going to be the checklist items. So that's what we're looking at when we are reviewing these LID submittals. However, keep in mind that the checklist is not comprehensive. There are additional submittal items that are only listed in the manual. So be sure you're referencing your manual when preparing the submittal. Specific example of this is the maintenance section, which has many items that are not covered by the checklist. In many cases, an initial stormwater LID submittal will be required in the entitlement phase or as part of a discretionary application, and this will be the first step in integrating LID design strategies into your project. Typically, this is more of a conceptual LID design based on reasonably foreseeable improvements to ensure enough stormwater mitigation features can fit into the development. Working out the LID design details at this stage will greatly help to expedite the review of the final LID submittal later in the process. Beyond utilizing these resources, a good LID submittal starts with a detailed narrative. Clearly explaining your proposed design, the type and priority of BMPs proposed, how treatment and trash capture are achieved, how much volume capture is achieved, offsets, pollution prevention measures, runoff reduction measures, etc. All that will prime the reviewer on what to look for and expect in the report, which will save time on the review. Be explicit in the narrative. Even include what you're not doing, such as offsets or runoff reduction measures. Just tell us explicitly that you're not using them. A review is much easier if you tell the reviewer what you're doing instead of relying on the reviewer to figure it out. Consistency is another key for expediting the review. We're looking for consistency in 4 places: in the narrative, in the LID calculator, on the LID exhibit, and on the plans. A suggestion for maintaining consistency is to create a template of the LID report and reuse this for each project while changing the applicable details, but otherwise maintaining the formatting and base text. Another helpful item would be to have a dedicated drainage and LID improvements page on the plans. This page would have LID details and specifications for the BMPs, including an irrigation and planting plan. In the LID design, consider the location of the BMPs in the post-construction and the post-construction use of the site to ensure that there's adequate paths of travel, access for inspectors, and that it doesn't infringe on any future development of the site. Lastly, clearly discuss the maintenance and inspection schedule for the LID BMPs, as well as expected costs associated with each. This should not only be for the reviewer, but for the future owner or operator of the site, so they know how to keep these features operational, what kind of records they need to maintain, and how much to budget. So that concludes my response for the question. And with that, I'll pass it back to Colleen. Thank you.
Well, thanks so much, Steve. It sounds like from both you and Jesus's answers, what we're really talking about here is just needing all the details, just the more details that can be provided, the easier it's going to be for a plan reviewer to review these plans and get these approved. So thanks so much for your input. That was great information. So Rogelio, we'll move on to you. And what we're going to kind of shift over now, talking about maintenance from a plan review side of things. So do plan reviewers look for potential maintenance concerns when reviewing these proposals?
Yes, do you hear me, everybody?
Yep, we can hear you. Thank you.
Okay. Yeah, most of the things that we try to look at the City of Santa Rosa is the instruments for the maintenance of these BMPs. One can be the tax district or the homeowner association. But in the mix of these instruments for maintenance for the record maps and how they're gonna be handled, those maintenance. One thing that engineers focus a lot is just the technical side of all the all the design, the numbers, how they're gonna build these fixtures on the site. But most of the time we forget the human side of it. Who is gonna be living close by these features? How they gonna see them? We have these training sections to be familiar with the Lean manual on all those kind of features that integrate they integrate to the treatment of the pollution that concerned and that is generated through the process of the development. But let's gonna see this in the side of the person who is gonna be buying a lot or buying the residence. Are those guys familiar with those kind of maintenance? Are those guys familiar with how these features work to treat the water? And I think the answer will be not. I'm gonna place myself in be a residence that I'm gonna be buying that lot, and I don't know nothing about these kind of things. There is any kind of easement through my property that are gonna be collecting water to conduct to any fixture? Can I do something in my lot? Since I'm buying the lot and I'm paying for it, am I allowed to bring some material and make a flat area in my backyard to kind of enjoy my property? Answer is sometimes no, and it's definitely a kind of the things that we need to make sure that these guys who's buying that property are aware of those kind of things. Otherwise, I'm gonna be doing things that I don't should to do, and I need to be aware of those. And I don't know who is kind of be responsible to let the new owner know about it. The thing is, and it's when the human factor is in the mix, that if I'm not aware of those kind of feature in my land, let's gonna say, I can just rid of it or modify somehow, and those guys, those features are gonna be doing the work that's supposed to be designed to do. There is right now some kind of this kind of conflict between the owners because they decide to get more flat area in their lots, and they are building some landscape walls to do so. That means they totally rip out one of the swells that is conducting the flow through the detention pond. So there is a conflict right now between those guys because they don't know nothing about those kind of features, and the problem between those guys come out at the point that they are shooting each other, and it's in the involvement of the city as a referee between those guys is come out, and it's not I don't think that was the intent since the beginning. And that's the kind of things we need to be kind of looking through the process of designing these kind of features.
Hey, really, I think that's a great point, but just to kind of steer back, because some of what you're talking is kind of a post installation issue with homeowners and being aware of their features. But I think the long and short of this question is that yes, municipal reviewers do consider maintenance in their review process. It is not a primary review, but it is kind of something ancillary that does come across our plate from time to time. And what we've seen is that a lot of times the design engineer is submitting plans that require the homeowners to do things that are not within their capacity. For instance, having cleanouts for drainage or infiltration pipes, or having trash capture devices that the homeowner would then have to take care of. And these are the things we really want you guys to be thinking of up front. Putting a rain garden in the backyard, of how is that really going to be feasible for someone who's going to go in and live at a home and potentially have a pet that's going to be running in and out of this rain garden, right? So those are the things that I think are starting to get on our radar and flag our attention of, hey, this isn't really feasible the way it's being designed. Yes, you're trying to squeeze it in on your plans, but in practicality, as soon as you sell that property or as soon as somebody moves in, they're going to try to alter that. And we're seeing that now, and we're having to deal with it from a municipality standpoint, where people are coming in, changing their property, adding fences inside designated swales to convey that stormwater. One, because they don't understand it. Two, it's kind of sharing property lines. But three, it just kind of wasn't really thought through of how someone functionally might use that property the way it was originally intended.
Great, thanks, Nick, for those additions. Rahulio, for your background information. So we're scheduled to take a break in 5 minutes. I think I'm gonna get one more question in before the break, and then we'll take a 10-minute break. So our next question is for Kat. Welcome, Kat. Thanks for joining the panel. And when does a plan reviewer need to ask stormwater program managers or the regional board staff for exemptions to the LID manual requirements?
Hey there, so I am Kat Harvey with the Town of Windsor, and typically kind of the shortest possible answer would be anything, any BMP used that is below priority 1 or 2. So any priority 3, 4, 5 that is more of a non-standard design, not landscape based, we would want to get the regional water board involved to approve that exemption for priority 1 and 2. And before doing that, we want to see kind of a thorough explanation and thought process for why priority 1 and 2 would not be functional on site. And unfortunately, lack of space does not always provide exemptions, because there are options to change the building footprint, change parking layout, other hardscapes on site. And so if there are groundwater issues, if there are soil issues, any contamination issues, those are more common to get an exemption approved, because the intent is really to use those landscape-based BMPs. And anytime those landscape-based BMPs, whether with or without a subdrain, are not able to be used, then we would go a little higher up the chain for approval for some alternate options to still incorporate LID onto the project sites.
And I guess a follow-up, are there ever exemptions related to like hillside slopes or something along those lines?
Yes, I would say kind of site specific, case by case basis, there would be additional exemptions if introducing more water is going to make a slope unstable. If the slopes on the site are a little too extreme to even use the planter box type that are a little more terraced, some of those would kind of direct you more in the direction of an exemption and some alternate options. So yeah, any site instability, any structural instability, those kind of things, there would be exemptions on a case by case basis for that as well.
Great. Yeah, and I think I'll also just add that this is embedded within the different priorities, but also proprietary units are needing an exemption, as you know, they're a lower priority And so we really want to have those priority 1 and 2s, as you said, Kat. And so I kind of wanted to call out the proprietary units also. I think that they're somewhat popular out there. I see them being incorporated into design. And so those, the exclusive use of a proprietary design would also require an exemption as it's embedded in those lower priorities.
Right, and not all proprietary units are created equal. So some thought into which one you're using and how it functions as far as treatment, trash capture, and retention. Definitely want to do that up front because the design does need to be pretty far along before we would present to the regional board for the exemption. And so if you get that far in the design process and proprietary unit you've selected is not going to work, it is a little more challenging to go back and redesign. So definitely looking at the different options of what's out there for the proprietary units would be good to do upfront as well.
Yeah, that's a really great point. Really great point. Kat, did you have anything else you wanted to add on this topic or any of our other panelists?
I'm all set. If anybody else wants to chime in, go for it.
Hey, Colleen, I have a little bit to add in there to build on what Kat said.
Thanks, Steve.
Yeah, so I just wanted to clarify those lower priority BMPs like 3 through 5. While they do often need exemptions, there are caveats to that if it's integrated as part of a treatment train where you're utilizing multiples of them together to achieve the delta volume capture and treatment goals. Then in those cases, if you've adequately provided that level of treatment and volume capture, then you wouldn't necessarily need an exemption. So I just wanted to throw that clarification in there. Thank you.
A great point as well. So I think I'm going to close out that question because we're right on time to take our break. So please take a 10-minute stretch break, get some coffee, and please plan to come back at 9:50.
Thanks, Colleen.
When it's time. Great. And Zach has asked, can the city or county provide a standard SWLIDS template similar to BASMA or the C3 templates? And it looks like there is an answer for Zach about Windsor's template. And I think we're going to try to pull up something for you, Zach, well, for everyone from Windsor. So Amber will get to your calculator question, Colleen will, and Zach, there will be an answer provided in a little bit if it hasn't already. Thanks.
Thanks, Edie. All right, Colleen, do you want to take it away with the second half of our panel discussion?
I will. Thanks so much and welcome back, everyone. That was a short 10 minutes. All right, we're going to jump back in. And so here we go, talking about pet peeves. So Dennis, if you could provide us with what are some of your greatest pet peeves or frustrations with LID proposals? And I think this does go in line with some of our other discussions in terms of, what's needed to really have these plans be complete and to a place where they can be approved. But can you elaborate on some pet peeves you may have regarding submittals? Dennis, do we have you? Alyssa, can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Okay, so it's not me. I was just worried
no.
with my unstable internet. Do we know if Dennis is on?
I thought I saw him earlier, but
He was on earlier, but he's looks like he's dropped off. I'll ping him. Why don't you go ahead and go to the next one and then we'll see if we can get Dennis on.
Sure,
Okay, thanks.
thanks.
Okay, so Kat, this
He's getting,
question is,
he's getting back.
okay, let's give him a second then.
Yep.
And I can maybe
I
fill
think, I
the,
think go to the next one, Colleen, and
go
then
to
we'll
the
come
next one,
back.
okay.
Yeah.
Okay, thanks, Nick. Okay, Kat, we're gonna move on then to our next question. And how do you prefer groundwater separation requirements be submitted?
So this one is different for the initial and the final SWID. So understandably, during the initial SWID and entitlement process, that oftentimes there is no geotech report or investigation that has been done. And so for that stage, just a general idea of where your site's groundwater is at can be found using the web soil survey. And Elizabeth mentioned earlier, it has some general data, but it is not specifically intended for use for LID. So we would allow that at the initial SWID stage. Also a statement acknowledging that the required 2-foot separation between the bottom of your bioretention and the seasonal high groundwater. We look for that in the initial SWID so that even if a site-specific investigation hasn't been done yet, there is acknowledgement that that requirement will be met and will be further detailed at the final SWID stage. And then during the final SWID, at this time, we anticipate that a geotech report has been completed, site-specific investigation has been done. And what we would want to see is we would want to see specific mention of the seasonal high groundwater in the geotech report. In the final SWID report, reference that geotech report, reference the elevation of that seasonal high groundwater, and specifically note how much separation is provided between the bottom of your bioretention features and the seasonal high groundwater, because the intent is for the entire volume capture section to be able to be captured, or to be able to receive that 1% or 1 inch storm. And so if the bottom 6 inches or a foot or more are filled up with groundwater, then we're not really achieving the volume capture that the permit is intended to do. And it's good to look at this in the early stages, because if you design your bioretention features too deep and have to shallow them up based off of groundwater, then oftentimes you get into an issue of not having enough area for the rest of the site able to dedicate to the bioretention features. So definitely look at this at the initial stage with as much detail as you have. And then at the final SWID stage, make sure that the geotech investigation has specifically looked at the seasonal high groundwater.
Great, thanks, Kat. And I'm hearing, a repeated theme of early planning. And so really, for a multitude of the design elements, it's really looking at these things from an early stages. And so these are really good notes to provide to make sure we're thinking about all of these things really early on in our design.
Absolutely.
All right. Do we have Dennis on?
Yeah, I'm here.
Hi, Dennis. Welcome. We wanted to ask you about pet peeves and design review. And so what are some of the pet peeves you have with LID proposals?
Hello?
Yeah, we can hear you. Can you hear me?
My audio is cutting out from time to time. I'm getting an unstable internet connection error. So occasionally my audio just quits on me. So anyway, pet peeves. We kind of touched on some of this already in what Rogelio talked about, and Nick as well. As far as the maintenance part of it, that's always a concern We have private property owners and they have these features fronting their parcels, and they're responsible for the maintenance, and these features aren't designed so the average property owner can easily maintain. So they probably wouldn't, or they go in there and they do something they shouldn't be doing. So that's one thing. But other things is, as far as in the plan review process, when their plans don't match their report, that happens quite often, where the details that they're showing in the plan doesn't match what's in the report. And then, as well as what they're showing as far as the detail on the plan may not match what they're showing in the plan view when they actually are constructing it. It doesn't match what they're showing in their detail. Basically, that's about it. You know, that those are that couple of the things that happen quite often.
Thanks, Dennis. I think I'll also just add something I see frequently is the use of inconsistent terms. And this has also come up earlier in our training today. And Elizabeth really emphasized the need to have consistent terms, but I'll often see, you know, a narrative that says they're going to put in rain gardens, but then the details bioretention, and then the improvement plan says something else. And so I kick those back pretty immediately. I'll say like, I don't understand even what BMP is being proposed. So I'll send that back without even looking at anything else. So do you ever come across those types of issues where it's just really inconsistent and hard to even understand what's being proposed?
Yeah, that is true. That does happen, where their terminology is inconsistent.
Great. Does anyone? Oh,
sorry,
does
Colleen,
someone-
I've got one. So Windsor does have we've created a submittal checklist that gets a little more detailed into what the report calculations and exhibits should contain. And one pet peeve is when the applicant will just go through and check that everything has been included. And then as we go through and we do our plan review, we find out that the box that's checked that says, you know, this has been included in the narrative, and then you read the narrative and you're like, I can't locate it anywhere. And so when we see that every single box has been checked and then we start to notice that things are missing, that is a little bit of a pet peeve. So when you're using those checklists and we're using some of those tools that the co-permittees provide, definitely make sure that you're looking at the intent of the tool and you're using it kind of as intended, and not just trying to check off a box for a submittal requirement. Definitely make sure you're going through and looking and kind of checking your work to make sure everything that's required has been included.
Yeah, a great point. That really utilize these as resources, not just a check the box exercise. So really good point. Wondering if anyone on the panel can kind of weigh in on the use of the calculator versus kind of independent engineering calculations. And does that ever get, is that ever provided where someone decides they're not going to use the calculator and they submit their own set of calculations? And is that, does that make it difficult for a plan reviewer when the calculator is not used? Is there
Hi,
anyone
this is Jesus. I could jump in a little bit on that. Actually, that does happen from time to time, where either they will not use the calculator at all, or supplement their calculations with from the calculator with their own calculations, because the calculator doesn't support the BMP that either they created or modified in some way. And at the City of Santa Rosa, we don't accept it if they don't use the calculator. So there's not really a solution for that. I kind of which the calculator could be expanded. Maybe it can. I don't know who could do it to include other scenarios and possibly like treatment train options where you can cobble it together and get the output from it. But that does happen a lot. It's very difficult to check their calculations because they're often not complete, like, you know, hand calcs you do in pencil. They're harder to check, and you can't use the calculator to check it, which is one of the tactics that I use. So that is definitely a pet peeve as well.
Yeah, thanks. And, you know, we had some comments in the chat on the calculator. And so I do think that there's, you know, an area where we need to kind of sit as a group, as co-permittees, and look at, you know, some of these issues to facilitate improvement. So hopefully the calculator can be more user-friendly in the future. And Flannery, I don't mean to put you on the spot, but I saw you had chimed in the chat with a response that I wasn't able to read. Would you be willing to hop on and kind of address the comments on the calculator? We're going to move into a panel question on the calculator, so this is good timing to kind of address some of these calculator concerns and issues.
Sure, no problem. So my name is Flannery Banks. I'm the stormwater engineer at City of Santa Rosa. We acknowledge the issues with the calculator. And I think one good thing for design engineers to understand is that our reviewing engineers, our plan reviewing engineers, they have to know so many state laws, federal laws, local laws, all the standards. These are engineers that don't just specialize in stormwater. Here at the city, we don't have a stormwater plan reviewer. And so it really slows the project review time when projects need to propose something that doesn't fit well into the box. And so that's the point where it usually gets pulled aside for more detailed review. And that's part of the reason why we stick to the requirement of the calculator, is in part just our own staff ability to back check. So I would say to consultants, to be concise and keep you guys flowing, the better you can tell the story, to mimic what was in the first panel discussion, the better you can tell the story to staff and essentially hold our hands through what you're proposing, the smoother your process will be. So even if you've proposed a design 8 times to us, every site is different. We're reviewing literally hundreds of plans and plan sets. So the better that you can independently tell that whole story. But we are working on an improvement. We do recognize that engineers need the ability to engineer. So we are looking at the possibility to supply more approved calculations that consultants can use for their design when you start having more things like more complicated treatment trains, especially what you would experience in infill projects. So we are working on that. You're probably not going to see any updates from us due to staff time and funding before the next permit. We just don't think that's a good use of our time and budgets when we know that we'll be getting a new permit and then we'll have to work on a new LID manual. So those updates will happen with the next LID manual, not this one, and we won't be revising it in the interim. So keep those questions coming to me, or those comments or feedback of what you'd like to see. I do have a process for tracking all that where we've been accumulating those things. So hope
Thanks,
that helps.
Flannery. Again, I didn't mean to put you on the spot, but I knew you were the go-to person for the calculator. So I appreciate you stepping in and helping us address those questions in the chat. And keeping in the theme with the calculator, Jesus, you know, the calculator is on the Santa Rosa website. And I think there's some confusion on how do I know what is the most recent version, and how do I know I'm working in the most recent version of the calculator? And so can you point us in the right direction on using the calculator?
Hi, everybody. I just keep on talking here, so I'm going to go again. Basically, on the calculator itself, if you open it up on the website, as just stated, if you go to the summary page, which is the page that will open up when you first open it up, I'm gonna look at it myself. It is just below where it says go to www, so on and so forth for the latest version of the calculator. Right beneath that, it says rev for revision date, I assume. And then it gives a string of numbers. That one there is the most recent, and it's got additional numbers besides just the date, but it was last updated on 11/21 of 2019. So it does help. I would like to say as a reviewer, if, and the truth is most people will have this as their only version since it hasn't been updated in a while, but there was a time frame when they were updated much more frequently, and it was difficult to keep up with which calculator people were using. And what I've always thought would be a good method to get around that issue is to just state in the narrative what exact revision date you're using for the calculator, which one you're using, and it's right there on the summary page. And then we can verify that someone doesn't just have an old one sitting around. Maybe it's from 2017 or who knows when. And there are quite a few other versions of this calculator available, and they don't look a whole heck of a lot different from one another. That is the truth of the matter. Because, I mean, there are some slight differences. Some have more pages or less pages in the tab section, or they're on, but they basically look like an Excel spreadsheet with a bunch of places you can put data. And then the information that's spit out of them as well is going to look pretty much the same from all the versions, which will give you a summary page and the individual BMP pages where it verifies the dimensions used and the percentage of achievement of the various goals. So putting it in the narrative is the way that I would like to espouse as the way moving forward, and hopefully people will agree to doing so. And then I think I already said that, and others have mentioned as well, the calculator, it does have some limitations in that it can only use the predetermined city details or details from the LID manual, and it's preloaded in a click down menu. But I would love to see it expanded. Sounds like it will be, and it's just a staffing and time issue to get it to do so. And I've always would like to see it be expanded, if it's even possible, to cover treatment train too, where it has a combination of different features to satisfy the various, excuse me, the various goals. And I guess that's it on that.
Great, thank you. And to, I'd like to direct everyone to the chat where there's a link to the stormwater calculator. So thanks, Edie, for providing that. And, you know, something I would recommend is to not save the calculator to your computer. That I would go to the city's website every time you're going to start a new project, and you know, of course, you'll have to save it to add in your information and save your calculations, but I wouldn't save the calculator and use the saved version to your hard drive to start a new project. Always start it from the website. And that way, if there are updates, you'll be sure that you're using the most recent version. Is there any other discussion on the calculator, either from the panelists or Edie? Do we have anything in the chat related to the calculator?
Nothing new, just the questions I brought up before you started, unless the questions were not answered. So if Zach and Amber, if you don't feel like your question was answered, let us know. You can chime in actually directly or throw it in the chat.
Hey, Colleen, I just want to throw it out there that the calculator is required to be used by approval of the LID manual from the regional board. So we cannot accept the engineered calcs. And if they do that, there's going to be a different path of approval, which may take a little bit more time for the review. And there's going to be a narrative that would have to be provided of why we couldn't use the calculator. So I just want to make sure that that's out there. And the reason for the calculator was to create consistency, and that we didn't have to do all this back of the envelope calculations to verify things were done correctly. And I think we've heard the design community say they want something a little more transparent, so they know what's being done in the backdrop. And so that is on all of the co-permittees radar. And we are planning to update that calculator, and we'll be reaching out to this group, to everybody on this call, and just to the design community in general, to find out what other updates might be beneficial. So I would encourage all of you, as you're using that, if there's a pet peeve or a nuance or something that might help streamline things or make things more transparent, let us know so we can incorporate that into the new update. I'd also say that once you're in the calculator, on row 3, column S of the Excel spreadsheet, and that has the version of the calculator, and you do want to make sure that it's the 8.11.0. And I definitely think that's something that we can improve on, how we identify these calculators going forward. And I agree with what you put in the comments there, Zach, that we should also add that as a feature to be permanently printed that can't be altered. And so we'll work on getting that updated as well too. So I appreciate that comment.
Yeah, thanks, Nick. And I think one of the questions, I don't remember it specifically in the chat, but it had to do with a BMP not being available to select to do the calculations. Can you remind me, was it, I can't remember which BMP wasn't there, but I think the question is, what do you select if the BMP is missing? And do we have any input on that?
The question was how to calculate a treatment for a bioretention facility and vegetated buffer strip in the LID calculator. And the only options to calculate treatment are for a swale or a vertical planter box, was the comment.
Thanks for refreshing my memory on that. Do we have anyone that can address that specifically, or maybe address that offline with the commenter?
I think I can answer that question. My understanding is that the vertical planter box is basically just indicating that treatment is vertical. It's a ponded situation. So that would be applicable to any ponded type BMP, such as bioretention, rain garden, etc. And then for vegetated buffer strip, which I believe was the other question, my understanding there is that as long as your flow is meeting the specifications for a vegetated buffer strip, being that at least 15-foot flow length, minimum 2% slope. If you're sheet flowing over that, then that automatically addresses your treatment requirement without needing to use the calculator explicitly for those treatment calculations. Does that answer the question, or does anyone have anything to add or clarify on that?
Thanks, Steve, for chiming in and your input on that.
I would just, sorry if I could cut you off, Colleen.
Absolutely.
I would concur with Steve, and we are, especially on the infill projects, we are running into situations where the engineered solution makes sense, but the calculator is just not a really appropriate way to handle that. But that gets into a situation that Nick was previously referring to, where you are just going to have slower review times, because at that point the cities will then have to engage with the regional board, which is a more streamlined process now that we have a set time for that, a reoccurring set time with the regional board. So it's not something that our reviewers will be able to quickly and automatically approve without that regional board tie-in process. So there are avenues if you get into situations like that, but it will slow a review time down.
Thanks, Flannery. Okay, moving on, Steve, don't go too far. The next question is for you, related to runoff reduction measure credits. And what are some common issues that you see in plans and proposals with runoff reduction measure credits? And maybe you could start, or I could do it if you want, just defining what that is, and then what are some of the common issues?
Sure. Thank you, Colleen. So what I was planning to talk about here is the runoff reduction measures as listed in the LID calculator, which we can use to get credit to reduce the size of the BMP footprint. So runoff reduction measures are design strategies to promote infiltration prior to sending that water to the BMP to limit how much treatment and infiltration you have to actually achieve in the BMP. So when it comes to runoff reduction measures and credits, a great resource to start with are the fact sheets, which can be found on the City of Santa Rosa's website, and that's in the LID BMP fact sheet section. Alyssa showed us that earlier. These fact sheets identify the advantages of these measures, potential limitations, and key design features that must be satisfied to qualify for credit. The fact sheets cover impervious area disconnections, interceptor trees, porous pavement, bovine terraces, and vegetated buffer strips. And then there's additional information on various LID BMPs and design strategies. So I'll go through each one of the runoff reduction measures available in the LID calculator. The first of the runoff reduction measures in the LID calculator is interceptor trees. For interceptor trees to qualify as runoff reduction measures, the trunk must be at least 25 feet from the nearest impervious surface. Selections can be made as to whether it is a deciduous or evergreen tree, so it's important to include a planting plan so the appropriate credits can be verified. On your LID exhibit, the interceptor trees must be identified, and the numbers will be checked for consistency with the LID calculator and the plans. The next of the runoff reduction measures is the impervious area disconnection, which can be applicable to both pavement and rooftops. For disconnected roof drains, be sure to select the disconnection condition, which has options ranging from 5 feet up to 25+ feet, which will impact how much credit you get. The greater the disconnection length, the more credit that can be claimed, all the way up to half of the tributary area. For paved area disconnections, it is similar in that the type of disconnection selected is important to determine how much credit can apply. The different disconnections are cobblestones, pavers, and blocks, porous pavement, and not directly connected paved areas. More credit is granted for porous pavement and not directly connected paved areas than cobblestones and pavers. All impervious area disconnections should be identified by the location and surface area on the LID exhibit, as well as the impervious area tributary to them. And then these features must be accurately reflected on the plans. The last of the runoff reduction measures is the vegetated buffer strip or bovine terrace, which are fairly similar to the impervious area disconnections. The difference is that the vegetated buffer strips and bovine terraces are explicitly on sloped areas, and therefore they have somewhat lower infiltration potential and offer less credit. So keep in mind the characteristics of the site when determining which runoff reduction measures to claim. The more credit can be granted for impervious area disconnections if meeting the maximum disconnection condition. To claim vegetated buffer strip and bovine terrace credit must be in conformance with the specifications of the fact sheets, which is a minimum 15-foot flow length and 2% slope, sheet flow only, and vegetation from the approved plant list on Appendix F. All vegetated buffer strips and bovine terraces should be identified by the location and surface area on the LID exhibits, as well as the impervious area tributary to them. These features must be accurately reflected in the plans for credit. Since there are separate sections for vegetated buffers and impervious area disconnections, it could be tempting to claim credit for both, but be aware this is not allowed for the same area because that's double counting the credit. And with that, I'll pass back to Colleen. Thank you.
Great, thanks so much. Do you ever come across issues between the initial and the final proposals, and maybe some things to look out for that might change between the initial and the final in terms of runoff reduction measure credits?
I mean, oftentimes the initial is more of a rough outline of the LID design. So a lot of times we'll see that no runoff reduction measures are claimed in the initial, just to be a little more conservative and allow for, that'll increase the size of your BMP and allow for your site to accommodate the potential largest size that you might need. And then you can kind of pare that down as you refine your design in the final submittal. But otherwise, I mean, the credits you can claim are still going to be the same. It's just it might change where you place them or which ones you actually claim from initial to final. So that's all really the difference there between those.
Okay, great. Do we have anything else from the panel on runoff reduction measure credits? All right, so moving on, we have one final question for our panel. We're going to present this to Kat, but ask that everyone kind of chime in with their experience on the process for LID submittals, and specifically looking at the differences between initial and final submittals. This is going to vary from each agency. So we're going to hear from Kat from Windsor on this, and then if there are any subtle differences that the other panelists would like to point out, we'll should have enough time to look at those differences between the municipalities represented today on the panel. So Kat, you want to kick this question off?
Sure. So in Windsor, for the initial SWID submittal, since that for us at least typically happens during the entitlement process, we understand there's still a lot of the design of the project up in the air. So what we look for is a general framework and intent of what the BMPs are going to be in general. Where are they located? The drainage management areas can be a lot more general. If you know just the approximate location of the grade breaks, the approximate outfall locations where the stormwater will be collected. We don't necessarily look at that initial stage for all of the watersheds to be broken up in great detail, but just a general, this part of the site is going to drain to the west, this will drain to the east, this will drain to the north. That'll get at least the rough calculations. We do oftentimes recommend not using a ton of credits. As Steve mentioned, sometimes that's a more conservative approach. But if there are going to be interceptor trees, if there are going to be some of those general credits, to use those on a conservative basis. And then the final SWID submittal just gets everything more dialed in. At that point, we're really looking for watersheds pertaining to specific inlet locations, roof slope kind of grade break locations, depending on where the building's going to be draining. And then also the narrative to get more detailed. If there's any on-site offset that has been used, if there's any alternate BMPs that have been used, anything specific, like Flannery mentioned, hold our hands through it, because we review so many of these that the review process goes much smoother when we're very clear on what the intent is. And that way we don't have to try to guess what the engineer was thinking. And so basically the initial gives us the intent, what the project's going to be moving forward with, acknowledgement of all the requirements. And then the final should get all of those requirements very detailed, calculations more detailed, and dialed in. Kind of the same thing with the BMP details. At the initial stage, just grabbing a detail from the kind of general list of details in the LID manual is fine. At the final stage, if you've prepared a site and project specific detail, typically we do like to see that if it varies from the LID detail in the manual, and we want to see what's really going to be used for the project. So those are the basic differences I can run through if anybody wants to expand on anything.
Great, thanks, Kat. Do any of the other panelists have anything to add? All right, so that concludes our panel discussion. I think that we've got some really great information from the plan reviewers directly. So hopefully for our design community, this has been beneficial in helping you be able to provide a plan that is easy and streamlined to be approved, to help our plan reviewers get you through this process. I think we've also identified some areas where the co-permittees need to make some improvements, particularly in the calculator and maybe in the submittal checklists. And so we'll look into those further so that we can have a process that's user-friendly and efficient and gets us to our end goal here with getting these plans approved. So I want to thank our panelists for your participation and information. Really appreciate you being here today. And I will turn it back over to Alyssa.
Thank you so much, Colleen, and thank you to our panelists. Can you guys hear me okay? Good. Okay. Yeah, that was great. Thank you so much for sharing all of your expertise with us. Again, if there wasn't anything addressed in the chat, we also have a Q&A session for the end. We can also recircle back to your questions. So our last presenter is Heaven Moore with the North Coast Regional Water Quality Control Board. She is an extensive amount, a wealth of information, and she has a great presentation planned for us. So without further ado, we also encourage that all the participants, if you have questions, raise your hand, submit them to the chat for Heaven while she does her presentation as well. Without further ado, Heaven, do you want to take us away?
Sure. Hi, everybody. So glad to be part of this training. As always, really great to interact with the design community who's out there implementing these LID requirements out in the real world. Let me get my screen share working here. Make sure everything's going okay. All right, can you guys all see that?
We can, Heaven.
Okay, great. So I'm Heaven Moore. I've been involved in LID for pretty much my entire career in various capacities and stormwater, of course. And my current role as the senior for the NPDES team, I support LID implementation in a number of different ways. So we'll touch a little bit on the different types of LID requirements we see. We'll spend a little time, but really I'm going to be focusing on what we're seeing that are kind of consistent challenges with implementation. And if anyone sees a photo of a site that you're particularly fond of or personally involved with, please know that it's an example of something we see that's prevalent in many instances. So I just wanted to put that caveat out there. Okay, let's see if I can get this to work for me. There we go. All right, so before we get started, I'm just going to spend a minute here. I'm going to try and keep this high level to kind of talk about what the intent is of these various tools and how they kind of nest. So of course, we start with, in my world, the water quality regulation, Port of Cologne, Clean Water Act, and thus the individual MS4 permit, which is issued to all applicable permittees here and requires LID to be implemented. So the intent of this is to protect water quality and to set those triggers and mandates for projects needing to implement LID. And then we have the LID manual and manuals in our northern part of our region for the phase 2 permit. This is really the mechanism to provide that technical requirements and guidelines and the engineering detail information that you would need as a designer. Then we've got these LID submittals, the SW LID submittals, which is the project specific submittals that we've talked about many times here. This is really the point at which compliance is demonstrated in the calculation and design. And it's site specific, it's project specific, and the initial and final correspond to tentative map and final design improvements. So initial design elements and then the final. And then the actual BMPs. What are these LID BMPs out in the world meant to do? The cleaning and infiltrating stormwater and implementing those site-specific designs to ensure compliance. And there's a few others I didn't put on this list, but I'm going to mention for a second here, which is the design plans themselves. That's the tool that gets looked at, that the contractors bidding on. Those plans and specs are where all of this work comes to fruition. So it has a really big role in making sure what gets constructed, in fact, carries out the intent through all of these other mechanisms. And then one footnote on this too, which is there are other regulatory mechanisms which will require LID to be implemented, including the construction general permit, which also applies to schools and some of our other entities that are regulated by the state only, and also 401 permitting. So if you have a 401 permit, you may be required to do that. So I just wanted to start here, because we're going to come back to the discussion around intent. And then just for a minute to talk about, we all have a role, from, the engineer of record who's doing the specific design and ensuring those calculations are sound and the details and requirements are, constructible out in the world and that they're going to function, to the legally responsible person, which if there's a CGP involved is actually a designated responsible entity or individual. And municipal staff, you have all done a fantastic job here of talking through your roles and your responsibilities and review. And then myself and my team, right, the regional board and state board, having roles in making sure that the protection of water quality occurs. So I just wanted to kind of highlight, we all have a piece of making this work out in the real world. So let's spend just a minute here. We'll talk a little bit about LID. You guys are all super familiar, so I'll just spend a second here. So just really what we're talking about is what the intent of these features are in the real world as they're constructed. They're meant for these more frequent, smaller rain events, the 1 inch or in the northern part of our region, 85th percentile rain event. They're meant to improve the stormwater quality. They're vegetated infiltration-based, small-scale features that mimic the hydrology of the undeveloped site. And they're meant to treat and address pollutants closer to the source, instead of the alternative of a much further off centralized treatment. Okay, one other piece I wanted to talk about is trash. And I'm going to start here, even though it's a detailed point. Trash is specifically called out as a pollutant of concern, both within the MS4 permit and statewide. And I wanted to spend a minute to talk about the 2 different requirements, because I think it's a lot of confusion out in the world, and understandably. So the trash amendment is a statewide trash amendment that was put in place and amended the ocean plan and the enclosed bays and estuaries plans statewide. They're really focused on high trash generation areas and larger trash. It's a plan to capture and treat, prevent the discharge of trash. And the size of trash that they're talking about is defined is that 5 millimeters, which is about the size of a pencil eraser. And there's a list of proprietary devices and separators that are approved by the state board to be used to capture this type of trash. Now within the MS4 permit, which is specific to our region, there's a requirement that's much smaller to address trash down to 0.1 millimeters or 100 microns. This is about the size of the diameter of a human hair. Now, there's no device out there that's going to do that well, but LID does. When we have those features that are vegetated and soil-based, that filter and remove pollutants, this scale of trash and debris can be handled. So I just wanted to spend a minute with that. Okay, now we're going to turn to the real focus of what I was asked to speak to today. And some of this has been touched on already, which I love because it shows we're all on the same page, and hopefully you won't be tired of hearing some of it. So some of the key issues we are observing with implementation in the real world: plants and vegetation. These plants are necessary, and they are part of the storm drain infrastructure. They have a very important role. And when we have insufficient planting or incorrect plant selection, or they're not properly established or irrigated or dense enough, then your feature isn't going to function as designed, and it's not going to meet the definition of LID. So really pay attention to that. We had some excellent presentations this morning talking in depth about plants. And again, not all plants are equal. There is within the LID manual, Appendix F, which should be utilized when selecting plants, but this is also going to mean you need to coordinate really early with your landscape architect and make sure that your plan sets and your LID submittals incorporate and speak to the planted element of the feature, not just the hard infrastructure pieces. And then I have to spend one more minute talking about floatable bark or floatable materials being placed in BMPs. What can happen if we have material that's placed? A couple things can happen. That's floatable is, well, it can float and it can be washed into the downstream system, plug that system, wash away, stop being effective at what it was intended to do, which is hold that soil and hold that moisture in place. And it can become a pollutant in its own right, being discharged into receiving waters. It can also negate the flow line and the depression within that BMP as it was designed to function. I want to spend a little time too talking about the design details within the LID manual. The design details in the manual are intended to provide and illustrate all of the design elements that are required. But as we just heard with the initial and the final, by the time you get to your final design, and maybe even in advance of that in some cases, you need to have a detail that's site specific. You need to make sure that you're selecting that all the elements are there, right? The depression, the high flow bypass, the side slopes, the fine grading elements. But you need to also select the correct criteria, the correct BMPs that work for you, so that you're not intentionally short-circuiting or unintentionally undermining any of the design intent of the LID feature. This example we're looking at here is kind of looking at where the curb opening is placed in relation to the high flow bypass. I'll talk about high flow bypass a little bit more in a minute. But again, you want to make sure that you're giving as much contact time as possible, that you're using and filling your BMP, your LID BMP with that stormwater, and you're not short-circuiting unintentionally into that high flow bypass. So selecting between the top detail and the bottom detail is going to be really important. The top one is really intended for when you're in a sag condition to replace what would have otherwise been a catch basin opening. This one picture is a little bit blurry, but I wanted to zoom in and spend a second here because the other piece, if you can see where this red arrow is, another really important piece is where are you bringing flow in? We don't want to bring flow into a curb opening in a location that is not the BMP. We want to make sure that we're not causing any harm by putting our BMPs in our curb openings in. We don't want to cause flooding. We want to make sure that it's effectively utilized and that stormwater is going where stormwater is supposed to be. And again, maximizing your contact time. This is another kind of example that we want to make sure that BMPs are located so that they they're at the low point, they're receiving flow into their feature and not unintentionally being located so that they're high in terms of elevation. Alyssa, I saw you pop on. Is there a question? Should I pause and breathe or shall I keep going?
Oh, no, I'm good. I just turned my camera on. I think my
No
Zoom
problem.
is stable now, so
No problem.
carry on.
Okay, if people do have questions, please feel free, or if any of the co-committees or panelists need to stop me to add something, I encourage us to be at conversation. This is an iterative process. I will humbly say that I have learned a lot, and things that I understood and held to be true many years ago in my career, we've learned from and changed, and we need to be able to continually adapt and revise our process. And so I humbly take that on.
Hey, Heaven, just to support kind of your informal request there.
Yeah.
If you can go back a slide, I just want to just point out to people, or 2 slides, that what we're seeing is this on the plan set. So when we go out for a punch list or a final review on an LID, what we find is that the contractor's been given this detail, but the contractor typically takes, they don't really read the detail. They just go to the first one that they look at and install it. So we're seeing a lot of plan A or type A being installed, when really the intent was that it should have had more contact time and it should have been a type B. And so these are things that maybe the design community needs to think about, of separating this detail and then calling out on the plans where each needs to go, and or really making it clear as a separate detail for the contractor of what to do in each of those scenarios. Because right now what we're seeing is that this is being grossly misinterpreted in the field and creating issues for us for long-term maintenance and functionality.
Yeah, and that's a great point. And I think, I touched on the idea that, we want to have site-specific design. But what I would also encourage you to do is provide as much detail as is necessary to make sure that field decisions or field calls aren't going to be made that undermine all the good work that was done leading up to that point. A really simple or small decision in the field, like putting the curb cut in a different location, like this example, undermines all the engineering, design, review, calculations, meetings, and work that whole teams of people put in advance to get a BMP designed to meet all of the criteria. I'm not saying that's what happened here necessarily or not, but as an example, a very simple field change can, kind of fundamentally alter the effectiveness of these BMPs. The same is true when we talk about planting, right? It might not seem like it to the landscape, those installing landscaping to be a really big problem to put a plant in a different location. But as has already been talked about, those changes could mean that those plants don't survive because these aren't just landscape strips. These are infrastructure with lots of design nuance behind them. Okay. Another piece is high flow bypass. So I just want to spend a second there. These features do need to have high flow bypass considered because they're meant to handle and designed for that frequent lower intensity storm event, that 1-inch event. But we get storm events larger than that, right? We still need to think about how we convey that 10, 50, 100-year event and what that does. So when we have high flow bypass within a feature or located adjacent, we need to make sure that we have that high flow bypass is correctly elevated so that the low flow events don't go into that bypass, but instead pond and infiltrate like they're designed to do. And we also need to ensure that the high flow bypass is properly sized for those higher intensity rain events. So there's an overlapping here. And so one of the common issues we're seeing is that there's not enough or any grade elevation, grade or elevation difference between the high flow bypass and the LID feature. So I'm going to pick on this picture for a second here. You can see where this high flow bypass is. It's behind the grass. It's a little hard to see, but it's flush right along the ground. So what's going to happen is, even though it looks like the BMP is this whole kind of rocky area, that's actually not going to be the case. It's all going to flow directly into the inlet, because the one thing we can always count on is that water runs downhill and takes the easiest route. The details too within the manual, those are minimums. So you should be thinking about what your surrounding elevations are and how much, you don't want water backing out before it's, for smaller events, but you also want to make sure that your ponding isn't causing vector control issues. So those are meant to be minimums. They're meant to meet that intent that I just talked about, but it does require some site-specific and even BMP-specific thoughtfulness and design.
Is it fair to say that I know in one of the details we have 3-inch minimum for the high flow bypass. Is it fair to say that that's a calculated? The bypass should be calculated based on 72 hours of drawdown. So we really want to retain as much water in that bowl as possible.
Yeah.
And we do want some ponding. We just don't want long-term ponding. And I think that's what's being grossly missed in a lot of these features.
Yeah, so you don't want standing water that's going to cause vector breeding, mosquitoes and other things. And you're going to have to look at literally the elevations around at the corners of or the edges of your feature and determine based on that what specific elevation that flow line is, because it's a fine grading exercise that the engineer needs to do. So it is a calculation. And it also, you also need to think about, like I said, your high flow. So how much head gets built up over the top of that in a 10-year event, and is that pushing out into the public right of way or not, is another component of this. Same thing for the larger, 50 or 100-year event, depending on what your criteria is set to. You want to still make sure that that travel lane is clear and that all of the flood control criteria are met properly. Yeah, this is a really common one, I would say, and I'm belaboring, but I very commonly see in my review, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute, bark, lack of elevation change, each of these that we're walking through, lack of education. Okay. And then this is just a couple of other examples. Again, this is an example kind of like that detail we first saw, where that location of the curb opening and where that high flow bypasses can significantly undermine the entire design process to that point, because it's allowing for short circuiting of that flow. And then just a reminder, we need to think about, there's a few things going on in this photo here, but what is the irrigation plan? What is the planting plan? If we have bubble ups or unique features, making sure they aren't holding standing water, making sure that we're not causing problems by putting in these BMPs, making sure that our curb opening inlets are at the low point and that we're not short circuiting. So if this entire area is meant to be the BMP and it's calced to be the size required for the BMP, then you need to make sure that the stormwater is going to fill that entire space before it starts to short circuit or to bypass in a higher flow event. It's another just really common challenge and issue with the implementation.
Hey, Evan, we have a question in the chat. It's kind of sort of related, but ponding. Sam Tipton asks, what kind of ponding area / volume is desired when it is not included in the volume capture requirement? When you have a swale versus a flat base, there's a big difference. So it's tangentially related.
Yeah, well, and again, so this comes down to, I think, kind of a site-specific design and review. And I'll let anyone else from the cities also speak up, the cities, counties, the town. But what I would look to is what is the criteria being used for the design? Is it a flow-based design where it's contact time only? Or is it a flow and volume where that ponding is necessary for the design? And is there any inlets or curb openings or downspouts or anything that's going to effectively short circuit that contact time, right? So if all of the flow comes in at one end and it has the entire distance and it's a flow based calculation, maybe there doesn't need to be an elevation difference on that high flow bypass and inlet. But if you have downspouts or inlets that short circuit that, come in at half that length or a tenth of that length, and now your calculation is probably not going to work for that portion of the trigger area as a flow-based calculation for contact time. So it really depends on the design specifically. The ponding piece of it, right? So I'm going to go to my simple slow it, spread it, sink it. We want to give an opportunity for infiltration wherever possible. Some of the flow-based BMPs I know are treatment only because say we have high groundwater or we have contamination issues. In those cases, of course, that wouldn't be appropriate to have an elevated high flow bypass. So again, it really depends on what criteria is being met from my perspective. Okay. Okay, so those are kind of the common issues. Let me go back 1 second. So lack of vegetation, incorrect vegetation, short circuiting, lack of ponding where ponding is required, high flow not being considered, lack of irrigation, coordination with the irrigation plan, bark, gravel. Those are kind of the really common things we see. And I am also reviewing, as I said, the construction general permit does require LID also. And so if you are in an MS4 permit boundary, one of these cities or towns here, the county, you're going to be, and you're enrolled in the CGP, you're going to be uploading your LID design that you've done to meet the city or county requirements into SMARTS, and it's going to come across my desk when you go to file your notice of termination. One and then two of the closeout questions are, has the LID been built and constructed for the required applicable requirements, and is the maintenance plan in place? And you have to select yes to both of those in order to file your notice of termination. So all of these issues, the cities are looking at when they're doing their punch list and plan acceptance. I'm also looking at if you're under a CGP before I'll issue a notice of termination because it's a requirement. So they're common issues, they're important to be addressed, and they're being looked at by multiple entities.
And from an MS4 perspective, before we do any final acceptance, at least in Santa Rosa, but all municipalities probably are going to require the same thing, is we want a final improvement plan, a final SWLID, and a maintenance declaration that's been recorded before we'll actually sign it off, so that the project can get into warranty. So just something to consider. One of the things we are seeing is that you guys are providing just the template drawing, which is meant as a baseline to show you an example of how to conform to the requirements, but we really want to see a drawing to what was actually installed. And that's really important for us after it's installed for maintenance, because they're being held in perpetuity to the owner. And should there be any corrections or maintenance, or they have to redo features, they have what it was initially installed to and calc to. So we need all that information. We hold it, and we occasionally do provide it to the owners when they haven't been sufficiently given it upon transfer of ownership.
All right, now I'm going to turn a little bit to construction and common issues related to construction of LID BMPs. And one of the biggest things that is problematic is a misunderstanding generally of what these BMPs are meant to address. So LID BMPs, everything we're talking about here today, are meant to address and handle the pollutant load that comes off the completed site. Roads, rooftops, sidewalks, driveways, right? They're not intended to handle the sediment load and construction related pollutants. And so a lot of times there's confusion, I think, in the contracting community about the term BMP, which comes back to so many of our discussions earlier about our terminology. So these BMPs are sensitive features. I tell people maybe begrudgingly that they're almost like wetlands or other sensitive features like that. They require protection while they're on site. So if you end up installing a LID BMP during the course of construction, you need to now protect it from all of the construction related discharges. And otherwise we get situations like this where the material is completely foul. And what ends up happening is it needs to be replaced. So when we have highly sediment laden runoff being discharged into LID BMPs, we end up needing to have them be rebuilt. That's really costly, and it's a huge impact to both the timeline of project completion and also all of the budget considerations. When we have these types of issues, we need to actually, in some cases, bypass or direct runoff around, right? Because these are located, as I already said, in the low point. They're in front of and incorporating the storm drain inlets. So the options are either to protect them robustly, and this one's not perfect, but kind of gives you a sense. Either protect them robustly or build them last to prevent having to reconstruct, tear out, foul, and rebuild these types of BMPs. They're not meant for the construction loading. Also, if you're getting a huge amount of sediment coming in, it's a really good indication that your construction BMPs are insufficient. So that's me putting on another hat for a minute. Okay, so some of the other common issues I didn't dedicate a whole slide to. I don't want to take up all of our time here, but that we do encounter, are the BMPs not being built per plan, things like geotextiles or visqueen being in them when that wasn't intended in the design. Again, maybe a field decision that negates the intent and function. Them being in the incorrect location or being the incorrect size, maybe a, utility pad or a light feature or something like that was added or moved into that feature and effectively reduces its size. Again, we talked about maintenance a lot, but if there's not a long-term maintenance plan, that's what can be a fatal flaw. And then another thing I look at, especially when I'm looking at CGP, notice of termination considerations, is temporary BMPs still being present, within or adjacent to these BMPs, right? That again, they're meant to handle the final site, and the temporary stabilization that happened during construction needs to be complete and no longer necessary. Okay, pausing, breathing, any questions? Okay. So what does all of this mean? So I've told you a lot about what from my perspective, what I'm seeing as common issues. But it's complicated. These are technically challenging, and individual sites can be have a lot of constraints on them. And so we have set up our regional board LID office hours. So fourth Monday of every month, myself and Brendan are available. We meet with municipal staff who are our permittees under the MS4 permits. And we're available to answer these types of technical questions, either topic specific or project specific. And in some cases, the region, we're available. What we would do is the city or county or town could also invite project proponent. If there's a specific project that was having trouble meeting the requirements or needed additional technical discussion, with regional board perspective. And so this has been a great tool. It's allowed us to both listen and support the LID implementation. And it's helping us to talk about these types of issues. And these are just some of them. Some of them I've spent time on today here. There are others that have been brought to office hour discussions, project specific, run on from, public right of way, how to deal with high groundwater in a particular location, BMPs and their, the distance they may be from a riparian area, wetland or creek, a number of things. So it's been a really great experience. It's a way that the regional board can support. And so we're really glad to be doing that. It's also allowed for us to be thoughtful about what in the revision process we want to make sure that we address and provide further clarity, specificity, additional refinement information. I know that Brendan spoke about a number of these already this morning, so I won't spend a lot of time. But I did also want to spend a little time on a couple here. So, moving forward, permeable pavement has been a point of discussion. It requires really frequent maintenance. We had previously incorporated it into a lot of BMPs, and we've seen it be unsuccessful in the field. So there was the move away from using that as part of the BMP, but rather to use it as a runoff reduction measure only. So making that more clear and explicit moving forward in the permit. And then this idea, we've always talked about LID being small scale, and for people who have been around a while in this, the world of stormwater, you can remember probably that years ago, we really just dealt with getting water off as quickly as possible and away from buildings and roads. And then we have this move to, okay, well, we need to reduce those peak flows. And so it used to be orifices and concrete lined basins and flow control only. And then it morphed now with, a lot of direction from EPA to being small scale vegetated, what we're more familiar with as LID. But in the future permit, I think that there's also this understanding and iterative process, like we spoke about, of the scale at which these features are going to be sustainable. And so I think moving forward, we really aren't necessarily going to be staying with the smallest scale that we've been functioning at, but some middle ground where we have features that maybe serve a neighborhood or a development in its entirety, or even in some cases larger than that, but that still provide all of those other benefits that we've come to appreciate and refine regarding LID, the vegetated-based, infiltration-based, small pollutant particle size removal, and all of those important elements. And then a few other things, they're more specific for the engineer and me. Improved LID details, making it clearer about what the details are and what they are not. Improving the structural soil specification so that there's things like sieve sizes and it's a little bit more suited to being a performance spec, to make sourcing that material and field verifying that material easier. Making sure that we have clear requirements on transfer of ownership when properties are sold. And then again, high flow bypass design criteria and helping to align better with that, once we spent a bit of time on understanding what that ponding depth needs to be and how that high flow bypass functions and under what kind of criteria. Generally speaking, moving into this next permit renewal, and I hope you all will engage in that process because we need all of your experience and expertise. And please lend what you have learned and struggled with and had success with. But the permit is going to be more specific and about setting criteria, intent, and specificity when it comes to LID. Okay, that's a whole lot of me talking. So this is kind of where I want to turn to the group here and the, amazing professionals that we have in online today. And I really would love to hear, from your perspective, what is working? What is not working? What are things that other regions maybe, or other projects, or that you've seen in other places or other states that we should consider as we go into this permit renewal and the subsequent LID manual review and renewal? How can we improve this process? Because LID is so important and it isn't going anyplace, but we need to work together to make sure we have good tools in place to implement it.
Can I make a recommendation, Evan? Can you just take your PowerPoint off?
Yep.
And maybe we can have people turn their cameras on so we can put faces with names, and for you guys just to turn your microphones off and ask Kevin away. And again, this is our chance to kind of direct and influence future iterations and kind of support this. I mean, the evolving process. I mean, really since 05, we've evolved significantly from the manuals we've put out, and we imagine that the next version will be another evolution, and we need to do this together. We can't do it just from a regulatory standpoint or even from a municipal standpoint, holding to those regulatory requirements. We need it from the ground up. So I'd encourage all of you to chime in.
I've been really enjoying the chat, the questions put in the chat. They're very thoughtful and they're not attacking the system as we're all learning. And we are all trying to morph this system to better our communities. And granted, we're dealing with pollution, so nothing's going to be perfect. And we need to really, it's a, cause and effect for each single feature. They're their own life, need to be maintained individually, and it's not uniform. So just keep that in mind, and thank you for your input.
Don't be shy. I'm not scary. I'll do my best to answer what people want to discuss.
Well,
Yeah,
let me, go ahead.
So why don't we go to some of the questions in the chat and start with that to get the conversational juices going. And I have this, there's a comment here from Fuentes. He says, does the regional boards have a general approach to seasonal high groundwater issues, or are these issues mostly addressed per project? And I suppose it depends upon what the issue is with high groundwater. I know with something like getting stormwater treatment, a solution to seasonally high groundwater would be you would get your treatment perhaps through something like a flow-through planter box or through a bioswale with an underdrain. But Heaven, do you have thoughts as far as volume control goes in those kinds of projects?
So I'm just going to go high level for a minute because, of course, each site is specific. But the big issue with groundwater is two things, right? So one is you want to make sure that the volume that you count as available to hold and treat your stormwater is actually available. So there have been instances where that wasn't fully kept and considered, and what ended up happening is that volume was always full of groundwater, and thus the BMP was ineffective. So that's one side of it, is you want that separation in order to preserve the function of the BMP. And then on the other side is you want to make sure that you are infiltrating. I'll be back up one level higher. These BMPs shouldn't cause harm, right? So we don't want to infiltrate untreated stormwater with high level of pollutants that are untreated into groundwater, right? We also have a groundwater protection strategy, and we need to make sure that we're not causing harm. So it's always this idea that, treat and infiltrate, especially when you have high pollutant generating uses, gas stations, for example, locations like airports and places where we might have fueling or other chemicals, those actually might require pretreatment, like an oil water separator, prior to the standard LID BMPs. So we also wear the responsibility of protecting groundwater, but that's where kind of that criteria has been for separation. And we do intend to make that more specific and clearer in the next permit.
Heaven, I have one part to add to that, which is, in general, you'll still be required to do the landscape-based treatment for the pollutant reduction, and then the hydromod component often has to be in upsized drainage pipes is usually the route that goes. There are additional challenges that we've been in a severe drought, which makes approvals difficult when staff has institutional or regional knowledge of intermittent high groundwater, and the fact that those really aren't showing up anymore on the geotechnical borings. So we have been trying to leverage any historical projects or GeoTracker information to try and determine those groundwater levels. So we have challenges on projects on both extremes of that question. And generally it's you have to do the vegetated component with upsized pipes and orifice plates or some sort of equivalent for the hydromod part of it.
Yeah, and I would, you know, turn to all of our fellow engineers here to also be cognizant of that, right? When you're doing field work now and trying to determine groundwater elevation, put that asterisk into your thought process that we're in drought condition. And, you know, understand, that's why I went to the high level intent, is understanding that we're attempting to preserve the function of the BMP and that we're attempting to protect groundwater. So yes, really good point, Flannery, there to bring up that conditions today are not our standard conditions, and at least we hope it'll return to a more normal, quote unquote, normal in the near future.
I have one more thing to add on the groundwater side of things. I think the hardest thing is to determine what's seasonally high groundwater and how we're going to help the design community to determine that in a most cost-effective way. We certainly don't want to have them drill borings or put in piezometers where they're going to have to monitor groundwater for a year to determine what the seasonal high is. And with the drought, like you said, the groundwater levels change every year. So determining that, we're going to have to use, like Flannery was saying, we're going to have to use things like GeoTracker, look at where the nearest site is, see if they've had data for over a few years where you can get a good idea of what that seasonal high is. Looking at the geotech reports, you can get an idea. Sometimes they can tell when the soils, just how it looks and how it's characterized by if groundwater's been moving through it or not. But we're going to have to use historical data, probably the best we can. I don't know of any better way of looking at site-specific information because, you know, developers can't wait a year. There's no way. So we're going to have to definitely try to come up with some standards for the next manual on how that is actually going to be calculated.
Yeah, and I think the other piece of that, I know it's just a tangent or a related element, but is groundwater contamination. That's the other prong of this, right? Is we want to make sure that the infiltration being proposed isn't causing harm through the propagation of a contamination plume. And that's where kind of the work with GeoTracker and where we actually would pull in at the regional board our cleanups unit. And there are cases where the direction has been no, we're not infiltrating here regardless of the standard requirements of the permit, because it's a mitigation site or because it's it would cause harm in that way. We don't want to migrate plumes, especially in remediation.
We see Peter's got his hand up. Peter, you want to go ahead and ask your question?
Yes. So Elizabeth and Heaven, are you aware of some of the measures we use in septic systems with mottling, soil mottling and spotting? And that can be done, any time of year without reference to some geo tracker.
Right, that's what I was saying, was when you can tell, sometimes when they look at it, you can tell the modeling.
Okay,
At variegated soils, but modeling is really.
you just didn't use that word, so I wasn't sure you were aware.
Yeah, that's what I meant. Yeah.
All right.
And we do have some questions building up in the chat. I'm not sure if we want to take it to the chat. Edie, do you want to call out some of the questions that we've got going on?
Absolutely. Dustin and David have questions that are mildly related, and I'll state both. Dustin asks in comments, I'd like some discussion on how to create and maintain the soil life within bioretention facilities. From my perspective as a landscape architect, BMP plants are failing because we are designing a structure that is detrimental to or doesn't support soil life. And then David also has a related comment. I'm concerned about the earthworms being able to penetrate the BMPs so that they can continue to provide the naturally occurring water penetration. So yeah, soil life. Does somebody want to speak to that for Dustin and David, and for the whole group?
I did put a little response in the chat, and about the plants. Hopefully you're using plants from the approved plant list, because those can withstand the harsher environments more than some of the sensitive plants. And again, I'm very passionate about natural resources, and like I stated, I have portions of my yard that I will direct flow for filtration and along the hardscapes. But then other parts of my yard, that's where I focus on the microbiology, within the soil, and really promote the health of that. So they're completely different things, and I know it's hard to separate them, but they're different in many ways.
Yeah, and I thank you for that response too. And I think, yes, and so we do want our plants and our soil to be as healthy and robust as possible. And we've heard in the discussion earlier today too, right, that this is why we don't use structural soil in every BMP. We only use that material where the criteria demand it, where it has to be provide structural support or be trenched through, and that we should be using the more organic mix wherever possible and feasible. And of course, that's also a cost savings. I think, and the other piece there too is, we didn't spend a lot of time talking about it, but minimizing our use of plastics and fabrics within the sections wherever possible. Again, plastic this way at your edges to prevent migration, under your roadway or into joint trench. Those types of things may be necessary, but the fabric layers that tend to be placed this way end up getting high microbial growth and being plugged. And those could actually be physical, barriers to things like earthworms. A couple other pieces I think was already touched on, but we don't want to be spraying or applying pesticides in these features. But it is infrastructure. It is a lot is being demanded in these little strips and features, and it's a nuanced design process. And so I think that we all need to consider all of the elements and all of the demands on these features as we go through. So I hope that we can get to the point where the majority of our plants are thriving and not failing, and to where we have the best soil health possible within the features. But it's a great comment, and any thoughts and expertise that you and others have to bring, please bring it to the conversation here or later, so that we can consider ways to improve it.
Yeah, I would love to talk with Dustin, being an architect, and learn about what his experiences have been. I'd like to hear more about that with the plants. We've all had problems with plants, and that's why one of the reasons we did the talk. It's like we've got to use specific plants for these specific reasons. And I would love to hear which ones are not working, because I myself am trying to figure out for the town which plants are going to do well in these things, and being able to have them look nice. And like I said, that the public actually likes to see, and that it will grow well. So I'd like to have more conversation with them.
I have something, if that's in the chat, and it's been here for a little bit, and I'm also interested in being on the roadside. Chet asks, and this is for regional board, will the future MS4 permit speak to public paving projects or bridge replacement projects at all? The current model seems to focus on mostly private development projects.
Yes. And the current project, so back up, Brendan, if I muddle this, feel free to correct me. So maintenance activities, things like overlays or, trench paving, patching, those types of things are currently exempt from the LID trigger requirements. The adding of new impervious surface or going into subgrade for roadway work for public improvements as well is not exempt and would trigger LID requirements. And so I wouldn't say that it's categorically exempt for public infrastructure projects as opposed to private development. What happens as a result, though, is almost all public development does trigger some form of LID requirements, because by its nature, it's adding impervious surface. I guess the exception perhaps being in development on the site-specific basis. But the size threshold is being reduced in the new version of the permit from 10,000 square feet to 5,000 square feet of new replaced impervious surface.
And I have two things to add as far as the next permit. One of the things we were talking about was, we still need more discussion, but we were talking about the possibility of keeping road projects at the 10,000 square foot threshold. So that's something we can talk about during that process. And yes, understandably, road projects are a huge challenge because of the limited right of way. And so that's why we would consider that. And also we're considering adding a exemption for full depth reclamation projects, standalone full depth reclamation projects where a paved road, you're essentially maintaining the line and grade more or less, but you're basically, my understanding is you're basically rototilling the road in place. You're just, and so for those kinds of projects, we're also considering an exemption of the LID requirements.
I will add that the city of Santa Rosa had prepared an internal use document for guiding our own staff on determining LID, because a lot of public works departments do a lot of things that developers don't do, or a lot of our tasks are outside of what standard developers might be proposing. So we did get board approval with that, and I believe I'd originally just CC'd it to the co-permittee group, which is a focus on determining if various public works tasks are exempt. So it gets a little bit more into, if you're in this situation, yes, if you're in that situation, no. And Heaven and Brendan both saw that document. And then in addition, with the storm drain master plan, we do have a component for permit compliance, in which we are looking at developing a couple additional LID details that would be focused, one of which would be focused on a preferred LID design, specifically for our smaller roadways, our smaller alleys, where there's often just a lack of storm drain infrastructure. So that would be coming within the next year or two. And those would be in addition to the LID manual. And of course, those would be vetted through the public review process of the storm drain master plan. So the regional board and the co-permittees would see what Santa Rosa's proposing in addition to the LID manual. Alyssa, let me know if you don't have that internal guidance document and I can forward it to you.
Definitely. Peter's got his hand up too. He's had it up for quite some time. So Peter, would you like to ask your question?
Yes, so hey, we've been focused strongly on the project level, the micro level, I might call it. I got a couple questions about the broader questions of policy and what else we can be doing. Do we have any evidence, or do we even have a program to monitor whether all of this stuff is doing any good? Are we improving water quality? Are we reducing bank erosion from the smaller storms, et cetera, whatever the various goals are? That's question A. Question B, I believe there's a lot of excess capacity in some of our grand flood control channels that the water agency, or now called Sonoma Water, manages and monitors. I've often wondered if we could put some small low check dams in those channels and achieve a greater degree of groundwater infiltration and such things. I did a project years ago, and we did an analysis. It happened to be there at the corner of Airport and 101, where Caltrans now has a huge infiltration basin. And I found that channel downstream was seemed to be greatly oversized, given my calculations, versus what the water agency had projected to flow through there. So I'm just wondering if there's excess capacity in these flood control channels that we could utilize for LID, especially when you have the projects that need a, what do you call, a waiver or a variance because it just can't accomplish it on site. Maybe there's opportunity to do it offsite, like we do wetlands banking or habitat banking. Is that sort of model applicable here? So there's an A, are we doing any good with all this effort and cost? And B, are there other ways to do it? And is the water agency, the Sonoma Water, are they playing the same game? Anybody have any input on that?
Evan, I gotta jump off if I can jump in and give my 2 cents and then bail out of this, but everyone can always contact me at fbanks@srcity.org. There are a lot of studies, and we are doing some of our own studies internally, which Nick Sedano can speak to, which isn't so much on LID, but just the benefits of improvements and restoration work. And then to touch on the larger scale features, we have already been in talks with the regional board to be more open to that. And we are looking at the possibilities of that in the Santa Rosa Storm Drain Master Plan. We will be analyzing larger scale endpoint multi-benefit projects. So they wouldn't be in stream because that runs into problems with 401 permitting and wildlife and habitat problems. So it does have to be outside of the creek banks, but we are looking at that multi-use, multi-benefit. And then as far as channel capacity, at least in Santa Rosa, we are predominantly severely undersized in most of our channels. So we are also working on flood mitigation projects, but we'll be looking at that through the master plan. So please feel free to comment on our master plan. We reach out to the community for a reason. So likewise, we're engineers, so we don't want to be in a silo. So please feel free to comment. We appreciate it.
Thank you.
Yes, so Flannery was right on point there. So to answer your first question, yes and no. So there's a huge amount of data internationally on LID features and DMPs and stormwater treatment devices and what they're good at doing and not doing. And there's been many studies to that effect. Now, the details we have are slightly different, and the detail in another part of the state or country is going to be different even still. So it's not always apples to apples, but in general, the idea that we're using vegetated small scale soil-based infiltration type features and that they're effective is very well supported. That being said, we don't require monitoring your runoff that goes into the BMP and then monitoring the discharge out of the BMP at every BMP, because that's not the premise of our permitting mechanism. It's not kind of the approach taken with stormwater permitting overall. Stormwater permitting is largely iterative based. It's best available technology, BAT, BCT, based. And while it's considered a point source discharge, we all know that there are thousands of outfalls in even just one city. public and private. And so it's very different than, say, a wastewater treatment plant that has an individual single outfall that can be continuously monitored and a process that discharge can be put through. So it is an NPDES permit, it is a point source, but it has its own unique set of challenges. So I will say that a lot of what you're speaking about too, Peter, lends itself to the discussion, work, and scope of work being done under our TMDLs, total maximum daily load studies, of which the Laguna TMDL is currently in peer review, which did use all of the data that has been, that exists to look at what that receiving water can handle. Multi-benefit is absolutely what we're going to need to be looking at in the future. BMPs that provide, maybe it's a playing field that is also a flood control channel, which also has a vegetated swale element, which also infiltrates low flow, right? So as long as the function is provided, that's where we really focus. The in-stream part is not where we're headed in terms of BMPs being in stream. You can't use the receiving water as a treatment device, and you can't use it for an individual benefit, right? So it belongs to the public, it belongs to the environment and beneficial uses. So we can't use it because of a construction site that can't meet their requirements. That being said, creek restoration and the idea that we build additional assimilative capacity and function back into our receiving waters is very viable, and particularly as it relates to future TMDL work. So it's a really complex question, and I feel like a little bit of a scattered answer, but I hope that helps to answer some of what you're asking.
Yes, that's excellent. Thank you. And yeah, I'm aware of what water agency is doing in Dry Creek to answer the biological opinion. And I wasn't thinking of doing treatment in the in stream. I was thinking more of the hydro modifications. Yeah, but thank you.
Yeah, and and flood control and reconciling what was done to our creeks and their trapezoidal flood control channel configuration with now the ecological need and habitat need and beneficial uses is a fundamental concern of our agency and many others, and is something that that I think will continue to be absolutely part of the solution.
Hey, Evan, can I stir the pot for you a little bit?
Sure.
I'm really surprised that we have this many people on the call that have not mentioned anything about the challenges of constructing these features in such a small confined area to treat each trib area. And us as co-permittees, we talk to the board very regularly. We'd love to hear from you guys and your challenges and what other alternatives out there that have not been thought of that we should think of. And, as a municipality, I'd love to see larger features go in that treat a trib area, maybe not every trib area, but still have the same water quality benefit. And, my question is to you guys, are you seeing the same thing in your designs? Are there other opportunities that the current permit restricts us from doing? And is there anything that we can encourage the board to say, hey, can we go in this direction to further support the development of LID in our community?
I think Peter's got his hand up. Peter, you want to chime in?
Hey, Nick, thanks for the reminder. That's a great opportunity. So as one of the founders and a past member of the MarkWest Council, I have on my plans, and I intend to get it into the county general plan or the MarkWest specific plan, to take Old Redwood Highway, or I call it Old Redwood Speedway, through Larkfield and turn it into New Redwood Parkway. I want to put some meanders in that street and put some planting in there and some stormwater mitigations, as you're alluding to, some different approaches. And I would also have in mind to sell those stormwater mitigations to developers who don't have the room to do it off-site, much as we do mitigation banks for habitat and species. So that's one project I think that you bring up, Nick, is a sort of thing that could be done. So it's all conceptual at this time, but well, Windsor just did that. Who, Elizabeth, you must be familiar with the plan that Windsor just put in on Old Red.
Yes,
And I would like to get more detail on that because I could use that as a model for Larkfield. And
right.
I would like to do that all the way from Mark West School down to Mark West Springs Road, all that whole stretch there, and get the speed reduced at the same time. But anyway, where can I get a hold of Windsor's plans?
Well, ours is more conceptual also.
Uh-huh.
Thing's been really fully designed. It's the idea of it. But when you said that, I was like, oh, yes, let's marry that with what Windsor's trying to do. So we get some consistency all the way up and down Old Redwood Highway.
All right, we can do
New
this.
Redwood Parkway. I love that.
Yeah.
That's a great idea. But I can certainly get you things that we've got to put together so far.
Yeah, and at least in Windsor, you still only got 2 lanes. When you try to pull out of Molesbury's parking lot, you got 5 lanes of asphalt to get across.
Yeah.
And people whipping through there at 45 and whatever, you know, it's a hazard and it's ugly. There's no there, as somebody once said about Oakland.
I love it.
Yeah.
Hey, can I slide a couple of calculator questions? And actually, one is a Filterra question. Filterra. So
Edie,
from
oh, sorry, Edie, before you do that, Sam has his hand raised. I think, Sam, do you want to go ahead and then we'll go back to the chat questions?
Sure, just touching on what Nick was just saying, and I know this, it's not really a question, more of like a comment, but I know each one of the projects is going to be kind of a case-by-case basis, and what I'm kind of looking for is if there's that support to do large-scale BMP treatment measures for, say, a subdivision. I didn't bring it up earlier when you were talking about having like the small rain garden in the backyard kind of deal, but is it supported to have kind of a consolidated shared treatment measure in a good application rather than have like the little individual ones in front of houses when it's kind of difficult to kind of fit them in? As I said, case by case. But is it supported to do that sort of approach? We've done a couple where we have the shared kind of privately maintained separate tax district, kind of just larger scale one, because it fit better with what we were doing.
Yeah, and I do think that that is supportable on a case-by-case basis. I think it still fits the criteria of small scale. Again, I think we'll have better definitions moving forward in the new permit to call that out specifically. But if you can have, you know, one feature within the neighborhood park, or, you know, 2 or 3 throughout an entire subdivision instead of 28 teeny tiny ones, I think that there can definitely be a case made for that being equivalent or better. What we don't, you know, we're not reverting back to is the, you know, 15-year ago concrete line orifice controlled with, you know, chain link cyclone and
No.
you know,
Yeah.
razor wire. Right?
Everything's all up to modern standard. It's just,
Totally, yeah.
yeah.
So I think yes, and I think that we will do more of that in the new permit to be clear about how and when. But we want them to serve their function, right? We want them to do things we talked about and to be maintainable and an asset and to work in perpetuity, to continue to persist. And so I think that there's a case to be made that those locating them and scaling them up may actually improve the likelihood that they'll persist.
Mm-hmm. That, and this is more, it's one of those things we can kind of address and say that it's supported at an entitlements kind of time, rather than going, okay, well, we need to get every little one into every single lot and then have to say, okay, this isn't working. We have to come up with an alternative at, you know, halfway through the process.
Yeah, and I mean, of course, there's all of the engineering footnotes on that, right? So you have to be able to get the flow there, and you have to think about trash capture and, you know, fall and the fine grading details and maintenance responsibility and all of that. But none of those are insurmountable. They're just fun challenges to solve.
Okay. Yeah, I actually kind of have a follow-up question. This is similar. it's about, well, they were talking about having all small tributary areas and whatnot addressed as part of treatment. And then could you touch on the approach of the on-site offset? Because I know that's kind of a gray area. And, you know, when you get into the nitty-gritty of grading, that's one of those things that when we go to do those final LID report submittals, it's hard to show each individual area that sometimes some drainage just doesn't work the way you want it to.
Yes, Brendan might want to add something here too. So right now, on-site offset is allowed for the volume component of the requirements for LID, and you know, I need a better name for it. I don't know if anyone has any creative. But what we'd want to make sure, again, I'm just going to go high level on you for a minute, which is we want to make sure that from the creek's point of view, or your receiving water's point of view, that you're not increasing your volume and that you're infiltrating water. We could try to mimic what the undeveloped site did. But we also want to make sure that from the creek's point of view, that treatment is provided and we don't have, you know, big increases in trash and pollutant loading. So that's kind of been the premise that we've been operating under. And Brendan, if you want to speak a little bit about what's being proposed in the new permit on kind of that on-site offset.
Yeah, that's kind of where I was going with that, because it's kind of a high level approach of like, what is the overall goal of the treatment of the area? But then it's like, okay, if I sneeze on my site, is it going to be treated?
Yeah, so currently the permit allows, if your site has 6 different catchments, you can meet your volume control requirement in one location, but in each of those 6 catchments, you have to provide full treatment for each of those catchments. There is no alternate. And so, and for the volume control, we will have criteria for if for some reason you need to do that volume control offsite somewhere. And there may be some criteria, like for instance, if you have 1 acre of undisturbed soil and you're paving it over with 1 acre of impervious, and you're near a creek that's susceptible to erosion, that would likely be the kind of project where we wouldn't allow you to go off-site. We might have criteria for that. You have to provide volume control there. But if there's a demonstration that can be made that there wouldn't be any significant volume control impacts from the project, then offsite offset could be appropriate. And for treatment, I think we are considering some flexibility with that full treatment for each catchment, but I'm not sure yet what that may look like. We haven't gone into great detail on that. And finally, we do have language that may allow the permittees to establish in lieu fee programs, but there's a big but on that. I'm not familiar with anything that's been successful in the state for that, for treatment PMPs. I think it would be a huge lift to get off the ground at huge expense. It might be hard to sustain, but nevertheless, we're going to write draft criteria for such a program to be established. And that's all I have.
Thank you for touching on that.
Awesome. Well, Christina's had her hand raised, so we'll open the floor to Christine, and then we will jump back to the chat questions if that's okay with everyone. Go ahead, Christine. Or Christine, are you still there with your question? Okay.
Yes, can you hear me?
Oh, yes, we can.
Okay. I'm just kind of building on what Peter and Sam were talking about, and I think Nick's question about we're creating these very urbanized areas with high rise, and we're moving towards a more dense community, and there's a lot of competition for stormwater and other CalGreen requirements with permeable pavements and then we're trying to incorporate more pedestrian friendly areas. So I think as a designer, one of our challenges is meeting all the requirements of the various agencies, and I'm glad to see everybody in this one room to talk about all these competing factors, because I think, you know, incorporating more green streets allows more room, obviously, for capture and treatment, and provides more livable space. And so I think, you know, specifically in Santa Rosa, I think that's something that we definitely need to incorporate into our streets. Just a little plug, but thank you.
Great, thanks.
Yeah.
Oh, go ahead, Heaven.
I was gonna say, absolutely. So green streets, in my mind, you know, is a strategy for LID implementation and for that multi-benefit that we've talked about.
Awesome. Well, we have about 12 minutes left for more questions. Edie, do you want to go ahead and check in on the chat and see if we've got any ones that we haven't answered yet?
Yeah, we have two, and I'm going to ask them together. So maybe whoever answers can answer them together. If not, then we'll, either Ashlyn or Rob can follow up if your question does not get answered. Okay, so Rob Osborne asks, does anyone have any insight, experience, or concerns with mechanical treatment systems such as Filterra tree filters or similar features? How should these features be handled when using the stormwater calculator and its built-in calculations? And Ashlyn Finn asks, when inputting BMP info into the LID calculator, which requirement should we select to save to the summary sheet? I noticed that only one will be added to the summary sheet.
Okay, I'll do my best to answer that one, but I'll also turn to the cities and counties who are seeing these frequently. So proprietary devices are lower tier in terms of BMP priorities, because they usually do not satisfy all of the requirements. Usually they're providing treatment only, or they're providing you know, a particular piece. They can be used as part of a treatment train. They can be useful when you have really limited space or high groundwater or something where there's a really specific criteria. But those are the types of case-by-case evaluations that we'll be meeting in our office hours with the city, county, town, and project proponent to discuss. In terms of sizing and calculation, that's a place where I would expect there'd be supplemental calculations in addition to the stormwater calculator for those elements, because they usually have their own sizing based on whatever media or materials or proprietary design you're proposing. There is further discussion that we're aware of and coordination on kind of the high flow rate media proprietary units like Filterra that Region 2 is starting a task force on, and that we'll be participating in order to better understand the limitations and benefits and applicable uses of those types of features. But at this point, they're tools to be used when the standard LID kind of approach is precluded or limited for some reason, and do require kind of case-by-case evaluation. Anyone else want to add to that discussion, or did I muck that question up too badly? No? Did I answer the question for you okay? Okay. And again, I go back to my high level thing, is looking at intent. Whatever combination of BMPs or controls are going to be proposed and end up being part of the final design, making sure that they're meeting all of the criteria that need to be in place for these features to protect water quality. So making sure we've considered high flow, making sure we've considered trash, making sure we've considered the planted element, making sure volume capture. So all the boxes on what needs to be provided always apply. And we want to address that with the highest priority BMP possible. And we've talked about that a lot today. Sometimes those lower tier BMPs or proprietary units can be part of the solution. So there's not a prohibition on them, but they are lower priority. But we really need to make sure that we're not jumping to that first, and that we're ensuring that those are used in such a way that they're supportive of all of the criteria being met. Okay, end of soapbox.
The silence is deafening, Heaven.
I know. How many people are out here? Talk to me.
You know, I do want to just tell everybody on the call is we really do want to be a partner with you in the design and the development community. And we realize that even on some of these, some of our hands are tied and they create kind of unforeseen burdens even on municipal staff after we accept them. And so we really want to work together to really streamline this and actually be the model of the other, 8 regions in the state implementing LID, and every region's a little bit different depending on climate and needs and TMDLs. And so just recognizing that we really do need to have your input. And I'll speak for myself. I'm available year round. If you guys have anything that you think might help or to add clarity or to support this going forward, if you send it to me, I'll capture it and we'll try to incorporate it and start having those discussions with the board. And I would volunteer my other 9 co-permittees because they probably would feel the same way, because in the end, it helps all of us out. And we really don't want to be in a role of regulator, regulated. We really want to be in a role of partner and partnership, and really to improve kind of our built environment here.
And I would echo the same. So, I know Brendan's talked about our permit renewal process. There'll be a public comment process. We'll probably have workshops, right? Like, we want to hear from you. Consider this my passing of the red pen. If you have a red pen markup or an idea or a concept to solve a problem you've encountered, or to improve something that we've talked about here, or to jot down a brand new idea you think needs to be considered, this is your open invitation to put that pen to paper and send that our way now, later, or and definitely in the permit process.
Well said, everyone.
Did Christine still have a question, or I have one more thing to add? Christine Talbot.
Yeah, Christine, your hand is raised. Do you have additional comments or questions?
No, sorry, I kept it raised.
No
Thank you.
worries.
If I could just jump back in, I did want to note that the city is working on providing clarifications on MS4 requirements as they relate to SB 9 and SB 35 projects. That clarification is clearly needed, and I pinged Heaven, and by pinged Heaven I mean this morning during the training. But we are working on a City of Santa Rosa clarification on that, and we'll be working with the board on that, because I think there is further need for clarification on the fact that MS4 isn't exempt in the same way that CEQA is from SB 9 and SB 35 processes. It doesn't fall into those exemptions that cities have authority over related to setbacks, building heights, etc. So that clarification, at least from Santa Rosa, will be coming, but we will be working with the regional board on that.
Thanks, Flannery. Couple more minutes here. Any more questions or final thoughts?
You know me, I can always talk about things. So I'm just gonna put in one more reminder too. Just because it's something else I'm engaged with. So again, keep giving us your good ideas and your thoughts. Keep bringing your challenges to your cities. We can bring them up in office hours or individual meetings if needed. And let's make sure that there's involvement through the construction and, project completion phase. I know sometimes it's different people. We've got contractors in the field from outside of the area. This may be new and challenging for them. Make sure your plan sets are clear and that they call out all of the highly important elements we've talked about today and previously. The part about really having it be understandable for field inspectors, contractors, subs, is, I think, a really important element. So I think it's great we spent the time today discussing the things that we've seen to be challenging. Let's all walk away today going, how can I make these challenges more accept the exception instead of the rule, and how can we call out the importance of the nuance as things get built?
Trevor, you got your hand up. You want to chime in?
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
I just had a question as far as our drought goes. I know most of my clients have been trying to conserve water and use kind of a tank to capture the water. I know I've talked to you, Steve Snow, about this in an email. The requirement still is to probably treat the water and also the capture component, because once the tank is full, it would probably overfill and then overflow into, which probably would need to be another volume capture as well as a treatment component. Is that true? And is there any other object that we can kind of incorporate, or how should we proceed, I guess?
So if I understand your question correctly, let me restate it, make sure I get the right part of what could be asked there. Are you asking if rainwater harvesting capture can satisfy the volume component? Or are you asking if harvested rainwater can be used to irrigate these features? Or could you refine your question for me a little bit?
In a particular project, it was for irrigation of a garden. So it would, all our water from impervious area would be captured into a holding tank, then to be irrigated in a garden, which would hopefully kind of act as infiltration. But I was, curious if it actually could be used as the volume retention component of the LID.
If the volume is shown and there and infiltrated, ultimately, those elements can be used, but in personal experience with doing the calculations in this climate, those tanks have to be extraordinarily large in order to be able to be discharged for areas that need irrigation. So our irrigation need window and the overlap can be challenging.
Understood.
Yeah, and if anyone from any of the cities who is kind of working with the drought response, rainwater harvesting programs wants to speak to that. I know Santa Rosa at least has a rainwater harvesting program and rebate, and there's a whole slew of programs around that are separate from the stormwater requirement.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you so much, Heaven. You really were in the hot seat there for the last hour and a half. Just have some final thoughts I'm just going to share on our screen really quickly, just to wrap up our meeting. I know we've kept you over time. Let me just go ahead and share. So can everyone see my screen? I'm getting a spinning wheel.
It looks like it's working
not
on
yet.
it.
Not yet?
Yes, but it's starting.
Oh my gosh, my Zoom.
Turn off your camera quickly and maybe that will give it a
Yeah. My
We can-
goodness.
We can see it now.
You're back, but you're on mute, Alyssa.
What a hot mess. I'm so sorry, everyone. There's going to be a survey sent out to you guys, and there are PDH certificates available for this training. So please reach out to me. We will be having all these meeting materials available on the Santa Rosa LID website shortly. But if you have any questions, I've been emailing all of you guys a lot this week. So feel free to reach out and I'll connect you with the right person or get you what you need. But on behalf of all the co-permittees, thank you so much to our presenters, and thank you to everyone who chimed in and all the engagement. This was really great. Thank you guys so much, and we'll see you next year.
Carol.
Thank you all.
Thank you.